In a world where points depend on hinges,
there are hinge points inside us all.
history on a Segway.
It's overdetermined.
We are the points that our hinges have been seeking.
What this podcast asks is, what if?
Agriculture, fail or epic win?
What if it was Johnny Mango Pit?
What if the Ottomans had AK-47s?
Maybe climate change was a good idea.
What if the Ottomans had lightsabers?
What if the buffalo killed us?
What if Santa Claus was real, like an actual guy who gave presents every year? This is Hinge Points.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Hinge Points. I'm Danny Bessner, normally from the American Prestige podcast, here as always with Matt Christman. And we are very excited to welcome to the podcast today one of the great podcasters of all time. That is Everett Rummage from the Age of Napoleon. Everett, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So this episode's going to be a little different than the other ones. It's going to be kind of a lightning round of Napoleon, hinge points, and alternative histories. But before we get into that, Everett, could you just maybe explain why Napoleon is such an important historical figure? A little bit of a ridiculous question, but let our audience know why we need to know everything about Napoleon.
Okay, so beyond the obvious that, he's probably one of the greatest generals in history, almost certainly the greatest of the modern era. But beyond that, his greater significance, Hegel famously called him history on horseback. So what he meant by that was that Napoleon was an agent of change. Basically, wherever his armies went, he brought new modern ideas about law, about government, about administration with him. And that he spread, what was left of the French Revolution to the rest of Europe beyond France's borders. He also, he wiped away the old order. So even though he ultimately failed in his bid to, become kind of a universal ruler of Europe, he did sort of wipe away the old world, wipe the slate clean for a period of incredible change in the 19th century. So, you can see him as a guy, as the usher with the big shepherd's thing, pulling someone off, pulling feudalism off the stage, so that modernity, real true modernity, can come out and say its piece on the stage.
Perfect. So he's a very important person. Matt, do you want to add anything to why you think Napoleon's such a central figure?
Well, obviously, for all the reasons Everett elucidated, just the personal, set of assets he had, and the moment that he lived during allowed him to achieve the greatness that we remember him for, largely by embodying the spirit of the age, understanding the way things were moving and tacking with the wind, basically. That's how he goes from being an idealistic young Jacobin to the ender of the revolution, because he recognizes where the greater forces are flowing and makes it his mission to be there, to stay in the game. But, if that's true, then when we see him fall, we're maybe seeing, the limits of his ability to recognize the moment. But in his career, and we're going to talk about it in this episode, there are these pivotal moments, these hinge points, as we like to call them, where there is this sort of thinning between the possible, courses of history, and where a decision being made differently, or a series of decisions all contingently made, arrived at differently, sees him no longer, riding the wave of history as we understand it, but building an alternative future to the one that we ended up with.
And I think this brings us naturally to our first hinge point, which is a really interesting one that Matt and I have been talking about for a bit. And Everett, we'd love to get your take on this, obviously. And what would have happened if Napoleon allies himself with Toussaint Louverture? Maybe you could let people know who Toussaint was and why he was important and how he does or doesn't relate to Napoleon before we play out this hinge point.
Sure. So Very briefly, at the outbreak of the French Revolution, Haiti, or as it was called at the time, Saint-Domingue, is probably the most profitable, mile for mile, probably the most profitable colony in the world. It's a huge proportion of the French economy is just devoted to commerce with Saint-Domingue. And but the revolution sort of shatters the social order on Saint-Domingue, just as it did in France. And just as it happened in France, a civil war breaks out. Although it's odd because it has it has sort of the ideology of the revolution tied to it, but it's in this totally different context of a colonial slaveholding society where 90% of the people are enslaved blacks. And Toussaint Louverture, as the black slaves revolt to reclaim their freedom, Toussaint Louverture quickly emerges as the paramount leader among the different, although far from the only one, but he's quickly recognized as the paramount leader among the rebel slaves. He very wisely sees that there is an opening for an alliance with France, the colonial power that his people had risen up against. Because of the ideology of the revolution, the more radical figures coming to the fore in France, that creates an opening. And it seems sort of strange, but these former enemies are able to form a really strong working alliance that ultimately results in the victory of the Republican/rebel slave side in this civil war. Toussaint Louverture, the country is horribly devastated. Beyond what we could probably imagine, unless you're from Syria. But Toussaint Louverture emerges as the leader of this new state, which has a very shaky but real devotion to kind of racial pluralism and sort of a free Republican ideology. But the country's in horrible chaos. The devastation from the Civil War is just horrific. And Toussaint Louverture decides the only way he can really impose order is to impose a very authoritarian constitution with himself as governor for life, with a huge amount of autonomy from France. And this is a very rare instance in history where you have a decision of one person deciding the destiny of millions, because Napoleon writes a letter to Toussaint accepting him as governor, accepting the Constitution, and sort of opening the door to future collaboration. But he never sends that letter. It goes back, it never goes into the outbox. And instead he decides to side with the planters, to turn against Toussaint Louverture, and send an army to Haiti to reimpose white supremacy. That army is defeated in a bloody and horrific war, and the rest is history. Haiti becomes independent, but is ruined and never really recovers. Is an international pariah for about a century, and it's a very tragic end to a story that had a lot of very hopeful elements to it.
But in our world, Everett, let me tell you this: Napoleon does send that letter, and then let's go from there. So let's imagine Napoleon sends that letter. Matt, what do you see happening there?
It opens up this vast array of possibilities, because the reason that Napoleon is fixated on reasserting control of Haiti is because he sees it as the springboard for his attempt to turn the Caribbean into a French zone, to sort of make up for the fact that the British had completely closed off the Mediterranean by that point. And the United States at that point, which had not yet acquired the Louisiana Purchase, which is only a consequence of the failure of the Haiti invasion that Napoleon orders, the possibility of a French invasion of the United States, its soft underbelly in its very populated southern reaches. It gives, because when you see what actually happened when Napoleon was confined to a European-based theater of operations, he was essentially he couldn't overcome that final element of British naval supremacy. But here, you could establish a French military power on the American continent and compete for resources and power and population there instead of in Russia, which we've already had to end up doing it.
There's also a possibility, which is, and this is something I would really take with a grain of salt, because it's something, that was said after the fact. It's a very romantic notion, and romantic notions often go to the wayside when they meet when the rubber meets the road, so to speak. But someone asked this question to Toussaint Louverture's son, and he said that his father's dream had always been, once Haiti was secured and peace was established, to lead an army to West Africa to attack the slave factories and to destroy the slave trade. And, again, very fanciful notion, very romantic. But if it had happened, the whole world economy of that mid 19th century period, slavery in the New World was a huge component, of that Caribbean sugar economy, which was a huge driver of European capitalism. So if all of a sudden someone had come along and kicked out, the main support pillar of that whole sector of the world economy, that opens up a whole other Pandora's box of possibilities, far beyond Louisiana and Haiti and the Caribbean.
So that's really interesting. So let's take that as our starting point. Napoleon and Toussaint make an alliance. So this would change a number of things. One, you now have like a solid French-Haitian zone, a transatlantic relationship between Republican France and Republican Haiti in the Caribbean and in Western Europe. What happens then? So let's say they go into West Africa and they actually wind up impeding the slave trade 50 years before it is 60 years before it's formally ended in the United States, 80 years before it's formally ended in Brazil. What specific effects would that have on international capitalism? And then another question that I have for you guys is, what does alliance like that do in terms of Florida, which at that point is very open? France is obviously based in Louisiana, but could you see a southeastern United States that becomes part of a French zone of influence? So you would have basically 4 bases, one in France, one in the Caribbean, one in West Africa, one in the southeastern United States. What would happen then to international capitalism, and how would international capitalism's history look different?
Well, obviously that gives the French kind of one really key ingredient to, capitalist development, which is the massive amounts of capital that are generated from these colonial economies. And if at that time the kind of the future industrial heartland of Europe is under French domination, the Rhineland, Belgium, so you could see how that could, that system could have produced a real, France really lagged behind in industrialism in the 19th century in our universe. But maybe, that the ingredients are there certainly for them to have been a major player in industrial development, if they had held on, as you say.
And to build an alternative to British-led slave capitalism, which ends up dominating the entire global order. I mean, Napoleon would have to make abolishing slavery like a key to his strategy in America, because that's his force multiplier. It's his ace in the hole, and that's why I honestly imagine, like in the weak state that the United States was in at that early era, largely because it was held back from development by these aristocratic interventions in this constitutional system, by this like slaveocracy that at that point is really just presiding over a nascent social, like a political economy south of the Mason-Dixon. And if a Toussaint-led army marches in through Louisiana, promising freedom to every slave that they encounter, I can honestly see them rolling up through basically the entire slave South and turning the United States into just its trade and industry-based northern half, and then creating this, I think, inevitable then federalist English alliance against this threat to Anglo-Dominion. And then you get, instead of like the quasi-war we get with France during John Adams' administration, an actual land war with France over this question. And it would be around the same time.
And it's a little frightening to think what that might have done to. I mean, that certainly would have had an effect on. What would the reaction to that have been in America? Not only in terms of military and diplomatic response, but what effect would that have had on American society? I mean, I hate to say it, but you could really easily imagine, with the idea of this, kind of black boogeyman figure taking over the South. I mean, does the rump America become like, a proto Third Reich white supremacist state that it's, devoted to the destruction of the black race? I mean, it's ugly to think about, but we've seen that fear of the other is a huge factor in American history as it exists now. Imagine if there had been a real existential threat coming from that other at the very beginning of the country's history. It's, not pleasant to think what that would have done to people's outlooks and views.
But, at the same time, in that fight, I honestly think there's a good chance that the French forces win. And if that happens, then maybe you have, broken the back of this social formation that was going to destroy the world, or at the very least, create a context where you have this rabid dog settler capitalism trying to fight for its life in this context against this new, global trade order that is turning into capitalism, but turning into capitalism as Marx imagined it going, creating a unified social whole that responds as citizens, people who imagine themselves part of some abstract community, coming into counter with capitalism and being alienated along class lines, coming into class consciousness and then expressing themselves politically through that class consciousness, and get the internal road to socialism through capitalism that Marx theorized occurring in the moment of its birth, when he was there for it. I mean, he was wrong, but how could he know otherwise? He lived in Europe. He didn't realize that the real structures that were going to dominate and define what it means to be a member of a class, what it means to be a citizen of a country, was being done in the New World, in the United States, most specifically.
Let's talk about Napoleon for a second in this world. Does Napoleon, now that he has this Caribbean empire to really protect, that's also part of this ideological project, and he's going into the southeastern United States and let's say even marching north and facing some future Confederate foe at some point. What happens in Europe? Does he still go east? Does he still try to invade Moscow? Because I imagine the supply logistics would make that virtually impossible. So you don't have a Waterloo. You don't have an expansion eastward. Is that correct? It's more of a focus on the Western Hemisphere than what we actually wound up having, which was the French attempt to basically create a continental European empire.
Can't do it, your continental European empire.
And the other thing, Napoleon was not ideologically committed to a war with Russia. His vision always was basically France and Russia dividing Europe between them. And he invaded Russia because they were not adhering to the continental system, which was his sort of economic blockade, economic war, you could almost say, on Great Britain. But with this imagined French colonial empire in the New World, I'm not sure he has the same need to wage economic war on Britain in the way he did with the continental system. And so I think in that circumstance, the rationale for the invasion of Russia kind of evaporates. And Franco-Russian relations are probably much better. The French are much more likely to say, okay, if you've got to do a little bit of trade with the Brits, for your economy, whatever, let's focus on the big issue, which is how we're going to divide up the continent between us. Where's the line in Poland or Belarus or whatever, where our influences, trade off. And so, I think that could have averted almost certainly the biggest mistake of Napoleon's career. I think it's so much of, especially the latter half of the Napoleonic Wars, are about these economic issues. And so without with the economic picture totally different, you don't see things play out the same way.
You basically get capitalism with French characteristics, which would be a more artisanal, capitalism, a capitalism focused more on guilds and things along those lines, which is very different from the hyper steroidal industrial capitalism of Britain. So you also have the creation of a different order. And guys, I have a question for you. In this world, is Napoleon, because he's not expanding too much eastward for economic reasons, is he able to keep the German principalities effectively pacified, therefore preventing a unified German nationalism from emerging?
I think German nationalism was already emerging. I mean, I think the moment that the French walked into Germany, that was kind of an inevitability. But the question is, where and how does that find expression? Because there are circumstances. There was a lot of pan Latin American feeling after the Latin American Wars of Independence, and nothing ever came of it. So, it's a question. What how does that find expression if there's no kind of political military route to a German nation? There's also the question of there's at this point by the latter half of the Napoleonic Wars there's millions of Germans who are citizens of France, and so do they maintain their German identities? Do they continue speaking German but maybe have a French identity as well, like people in Alsace in our universe? Or do they fully assimilate and become just French people who are all, have names like Christman or whatever? and so that's an open question, I would say. But it would be very interesting. And probably, I would imagine if Napoleon had somehow won the Napoleonic Wars, the German question would have been a significant factor in European affairs in kind of the next generation.
Absolutely, in ways that we can't even really imagine, because the context is going to be so different. But yeah, he's going to have to manage, because Germany is always the problem, right, of Europe.
Napoleon said if the Holy Roman Empire did not exist, France would have to invent it to keep the Germans weak. And he tried to invent his own version of it, so maybe that would have worked. Who knows?
Yeah.
Oh, and you could also imagine, particularly beginning in the middle of the 19th century, as racial thinking becomes more and more prominent, or maybe it doesn't in this world, but a kind of a neo-Carolingian empire. You have a new form of European nationalism that's not organized around particularities, but is organized around like a Charlemagne, an imagined image of the Gauls coming back together. And then you get a totally different form of German nationalism. And here's the question, what happens to our boy Marx? Does Marx not go to Jena? Does he go to the Sorbonne? And is Marx now a theorist of, instead of industrial Anglo-German capitalism, which is really what he was from Germany, writing in the UK? Does he develop an entire new theory of capitalism based on, again, capitalism with French characteristics?
I mean, Marx was from the Rhineland. He was from an area that was a part of, Napoleon's empire. And, his background, coming from a converted Jewish family, his father was a minor technocrat. That's like, you could not, if you were trying to come up with a theoretical person who would support French rule in Germany, that's exactly the profile of person that you would. So yeah, my guess would be that, who knows, maybe his family goes Catholic instead of Protestant. And, Charles-Marie Marx is the most famous French philosopher of the 19th century.
That's a good one. All right, guys, let's go to our next hinge point, which is probably the one that people always ask about Napoleon, and let's just bring it out there. Napoleon wins at Waterloo. What happens? Why is it important? And maybe, Everett, maybe you could just set the scene of Waterloo for people who might not be Napoleon scholars, and why that's itself a hinge point in history.
Well, this is, to me, kind of a deceptive hinge point, because if you look at sort of the broader picture and on the eve of Waterloo, Napoleon's situation looks completely hopeless. I would compare early in the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon is sort of like, imagine a boxer who's maybe not the strongest, but is very fast and has a very good reach. So, you can get the most muscly boxer in the universe to fight him, but if he can't land a blow, he's going to win. And that's sort of how Napoleon fought these wars. His enemies always had more troops, more resources. But because Napoleon had this huge empire and this very fast-moving and huge army, he's able to, when a threat emerges, he's able to swoop in and neutralize it before it really turns into an existential threat. And you see that again and again in the Napoleonic Wars. But by Waterloo, he's basically restricted to France's borders as they exist today. There's enemy armies all around, and his only real hope is to sort of roll sevens every time. He's got about 175,000 men to work with. He's got well over 200,000 in Belgium with Wellington and Blucher. But he's also, and that's the force that defeats him at Waterloo. But to the south, on the Rhine, Prince Schwarzenberg has 250,000 men, opposed by 25,000 French troops. So that's dangerous. The Russians have 200,000 more men coming that direction. There's men coming from northern Italy through that route, and the Spanish are mobilizing their armies to invade southern France. So the idea that Napoleon could have, like I said, rolled sevens every time and defeated all of these forces with a smaller force without losing too much so that he wouldn't be able to go defeat the next one. But even if he'd done that, his enemies have reserves to draw on. And you can't say it's impossible, but even for a man like Napoleon, it's hard to imagine him being that successful, especially because by this point, the enemy armies, Napoleon was very fond of saying about his enemies, I'm going to teach them a lesson. And in a sense, he literally did, because every time he beat them, they learned from his methods. And so by 1815, on the eve of Waterloo, the armies opposing him are very good. And, the bad officers have been disgraced in the field and lost their jobs, and the good officers have risen to replace them. They've copied things from the French and learned their own methods. So these armies are almost evenly matched, unlike at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars when the French had a clear advantage. So to me, it's hard to imagine him winning. But this is an interesting question. What if that final war had been bloodier? What if the British and the Prussians were not the ones to defeat Napoleon? What if, one thing to keep in mind about the British, they had never faced Napoleon himself. They had always fought in the Peninsular War, which was a lower priority for the French, almost like the Western Allies in World War II. People, hey, you guys did great against the B team. Let's see how you fare against the Imperial Guard and Napoleon himself. And Waterloo was the first test of that, and they did have success. But the kind of narrative of the Napoleonic Wars would have been very different if the only time the British had actually faced, the A team of the French army they had lost. People would probably look at the Napoleonic Wars as, a Austro-Russian victory more than anything else, with the British playing kind of a supporting role. And that would have had consequences for European diplomacy in the 19th century, and I think it would have had a lot of domestic consequences in Britain, because the Waterloo myth was really vital, even I think still is, a vital part of British national identity.
Yeah, Wellington sure as hell wouldn't have been PM if he'd lost at Waterloo.
Right.
And maybe the Chartist movement is able to gain more traction against the regime of victory if they were just a bunch of losers who got their asses saved by the fucking Tsar.
Right, exactly. The post-Napoleonic War period is really a bad period in Britain.
Yeah.
And I think the country is in a certain sense held together by that sense of victory. In our world, we don't get the Great Reform Act until the 1830s. Maybe that radicalism in the late teens and 20s is much more intense, and we see something more dramatic happening in post-Napoleonic Britain.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what we're really talking about then is less a Napoleon victory, but less of a Napoleon loss. And to me, as a diplomatic historian, that raises questions about the concert of Europe. What if you don't get a concert of Europe? What does that say? And I should also add that a lot of historians will, of course, argue there was no real concert of Europe. You have the Austro-Prussian War, you have the Franco-Prussian War, you have the many colonial wars of the 19th century. Crimea, of course. But so what if Napoleon is not as knocked out? What happens to European international history if Waterloo is less of a defeat, more of just a lesser loss?
That if you imagine a War of the Seventh Coalition, which was the war that ended at Waterloo, being much longer and much bloodier, maybe there's not the appetite in Europe to allow the French to regain their status as a great power after those events. So maybe you have like a little mini rump France that's sort of as big a player in European affairs as Spain or Portugal or something, and that obviously would have put the 19th century on a completely different trajectory. Certainly in Europe, and probably in the places the French colonized, certainly as well.
Do you then see an Anglo-German rivalry that's focused less on naval warfare, which is what happens in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and more on building up armies?
Ooh, that's interesting. I'm not sure that the British really have an aversion to building up land forces on the continent. So maybe they would have sought a proxy for that. Maybe the Rump French state is a British, satellite or protectorate, and that's sort of, the cat's paw for the British on the continent. But I don't know. That's an interesting question. The British have always, in Europe, kind of divide and conquer has always been more of their style. Maybe you see, maybe they buddy up with the Austrians. Who knows? I think that's it's a really an open question. Just that things would have been very different if because the way things worked out. The War of the Seventh Coalition was just kind of seen as an aberration, a weird thing that happened because Napoleon was able to break out of jail. Maybe if it had lasted a longer time, it would have, changed people's minds and forced them to look at European diplomacy in a different way.
And that question is raised to me because I think the major reason the United States in the 20th century became a world empire is because France fell so quickly to the Nazis. Because I think in the Anglo-American imagination, France is always viewed as a bulwark against Germany, which is essentially considered another industrial capitalist rival. So if you remove that bulwark a century and a half earlier, that to me almost engenders a stronger pull, a stronger impulse to colonialism, maybe also in the United States, because now Britain is even more powerful than it wound up being in the 19th century, controlling, let's say, Normandy, and you have like kind of a Rump Vichy-esque French state throughout the 19th century, which is also crucial because, 19th century French thought is very critical for the development of liberalism. It has probably a tempering influence on liberalism. Benjamin Constant is the first liberal.
Oh, yeah.
So then liberalism itself, in a world where Napoleon loses Waterloo less, I think is on a almost totally different trajectory without that sort of, to put it bluntly, like this humanistic French liberalism that is not quite as found in the more laissez-faire version of British liberalism that winds up being instantiated in the United States. So this is going to bring us now to our final in the lightning round of Napoleon Hinge Points. And this one's a really interesting one. And that is, what if Napoleon had converted to Islam? And so, Matt, why don't you talk about this and really set the stage of what you're imagining and why this would be a world historical change?
When Napoleon was still just a humble general in the French army who was coming off the massive triumph of the Italian campaign, and was able to basically write his own ticket, he proposed an invasion of Egypt with the idea of cutting off England from their Indian holdings. And he had success against the Mameluke forces there and was able to install himself as essentially the viceroy of Egypt, and considered during this time, while he was trying to get some sort of hearts and minds campaign going with the at least the elite there in the Egyptian society, he toyed with the idea of converting to Islam and becoming Ali Pasha Napoleon, the independent Egyptian ruler, and then operate as a sovereign, stop the rat race up the chain of French politics and decapitate and replace politics in the Near East.
Yeah, and it seems like such a fanciful idea, but it came really close to happening. This is, I think, after the Toussaint hypothetical, this one is probably the one that came closest to fruition, which is, he went to Al-Azhar, which is the, kind of almost like a Sunni college of cardinals. It's the most eminent collection of Islamic scholars in the Sunni world. And he sort of said, what would it take for you guys to endorse my regime? And they said, you have to convert to Islam. And he said, okay. And they said, not just you, though, it has to be the whole army and all your officers. And that was a bridge too far. So it really came close to happening. If kind of the mood had been different in that room, maybe it would have happened.
Circumcisions were going to be an issue, though.
Yeah,
They could have, but I think he might have been able to negotiate on that point.
He specifically mentioned circumcision and giving up wine as being too much to ask his troops to do.
Yeah,
But in
if
our
he does
world,
it, if he goes for it, then you still have this incredibly dynamic, powerful figure who is able to marshal forces of history like nobody else of his generation. But instead of being at the heart of European politics and colonial politics, he is instead now charged with taking possession of a peripheral nation with a much more nascent economic and military institutions. And the question becomes, how is he able to deal with those challenges, trying to now compete for power sort of from behind the eight ball relative to Europe?
Everett, let's play this out. What do you think happens?
There is kind of something I always like to look at when you're sort of indulging in these hypotheticals is, what's a real life analog we can look at as the model for the hypothetical? And to me, the obvious one here is the man who after the French were defeated in Egypt, it was kind of a jump ball almost. Would the Mamluks come back into power? Would the Ottomans assert direct control? Would the British turn it into some kind of protectorate? And the man who ultimately comes out on top is sort of, not someone who looked like a candidate at the beginning of the process. This man named Muhammad Ali. He came from modern day Greece. He was, I believe, an ethnic Albanian who worked for the Ottomans. He was like a mercenary. Well, semi-mercenary, semi-soldier who worked for the Ottomans. And he ultimately comes out on top as the ruler of Egypt after, the dust settles with this power struggle. And he engages in a really aggressive program of modernization. Building a modern civil service, modern fleet, modern army, founding European-style educational institutions. And in a certain sense, he's kind of the founder of modern Egypt. And so you can look at, I think the jumping off point, looking at what Napoleon could have done there is, what did Muhammad Ali do, 10, 20 years later? He actually had a lot of success and, didn't quite succeed in turning Egypt into a modern country that could compete with the European countries, but he was able to do a lot. So I think any discussion of Napoleon, being active in Egypt has to start with the fact that it seems like that it was actually fertile ground for the type of modernization program he probably would have tried to do.
So does this mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Napoleon is in Egypt, and instead of doing the whole Napoleonic Wars like they actually happened in history, he sets a base in Egypt and he begins a program of modernization and development as an Islamic leader there. So instead of getting the Napoleonic Wars, you have Napoleon basically stay there until the 1820s, let's say 1820, 1825, and he has a base in Egypt and he has a sort of Republican French base in France. And he didn't do the German campaigns and he didn't do the Russian campaigns. So now it's 1825, 1830. Napoleon has those two power bases. What is going on in Europe then? What is going on with Napoleon? Because I assume that his ambition, let's assume that as static and unchanged, that he still wants to basically be the world historical figure who transforms continental Europe and now the Islamic world. Maybe he fashions himself as sort of like this paragon of Islam, a kind of Cyrus figure. What as Cyrus vis-a-vis Judaism in a sense. So what happens?
Well, I think that probably the French would have been defeated in Europe by the Allies much quicker. I actually would say that probably what happens, probably that there's no version of the French Revolution at that point that doesn't end with the general taking power. So, maybe this is, instead of that, maybe Marshal Bernadotte is the Napoleon figure in this universe. But none of those guys were as good as Napoleon, and none of them were as lucky as Napoleon. So, maybe by 1806, 1807, 1808, there is no more revolutionary France. And maybe kind of the, that sort of wiping the slate clean that Napoleon's conquests did in Europe doesn't come to pass. So maybe you get a Europe that's much less developed, politically, economically, socially, and then, a rising power in the East. You could maybe imagine a world in which, there's the 19th century sees something close to parity between, let's say, Turkey, modern day Turkey, the Levant, and Egypt, either from Napoleon conquering these areas or the local authorities having to copy his methods to resist him, much like happened in Europe. So maybe you get a 19th century where, the Ottoman Empire and Egypt are players in the same way that the European powers were players. And that, maybe there's Islamic colonies, and we get to see, how that sort of cultural and political and economic setup would have approached colonialism. It's another one where there's, the Pandora's box is just absolutely massive, and you could see this, working out any number of different ways.
And to me, the most interesting, or one of the most interesting things, is what if you get a sort of Egypt-based liberalism? Because Napoleon is the one who spreads liberalism from France to continental Europe. But what if he begins and takes those ideas seriously and begins to develop them more in the Levant than continental Europe? And so you have a totally different ideological history of Europe that it maybe is still way more monarchist than it wound up being, way more authoritarian, way more focused on that. And sort of you get the blending of a French-style liberal capitalism in the Middle East as opposed to elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like in the early 19th century, there was this idea that the British represented laissez-faire, the really hard laissez-faire version of liberalism, and then the American system is a more sort of holistic view of capitalist development, shall we say. Maybe in this world that's associated with Egypt. And that makes you think, because, once ideas get associated with certain regions, cultures, etc., they sort of take baggage from that. So maybe that, view of the world gets to be seen as an Islamic view of the world rather than a Christian view of the world. And that could, maybe in a sense, be a barrier to those ideas entering the European mainstream as they did in our universe.
You also get permanent French access to the oil fields that will be discovered later, which is actually, or a permanent Napoleonic aspect in this sort of liminal space polity. So you maybe would get a capitalism that is informed by the artisan-centered nature of French capitalism, but then in the early 20th century, this polity finds oil, and then you get this marker of industrialization. Matt, what do you think Napoleon's conversion impact might have had, however you want to take it in whatever direction?
Yeah, I just think about what would happen in France if you don't have a Napoleon to fill that spot. Yeah, I think you definitely have a France that's defeated much earlier, where you have a restoration much earlier, which of course only serves to bottle up a lot of social unrest and alienation that in the world where Napoleon becomes emperor gets vented off in his series of conquests and wars, and like a war-based state that sort of disciplines and organizes all of the discontent of this rapidly modernizing society. And in this world, if you're just getting a succession of these attempts to affirm a monarchical center, at the behest of a European dynastic houses that have a vested interest in preventing those evil spirits from getting loose in the world again, then I think you still end up having to have some sort of maybe early ignition of a great power conflagration, sort of defining all of 19th century politics.
So let's go to our actual final hinge points, and this is: what if Napoleon invaded England? The year is 1804, and Napoleon turns west. What happens, Everett? Describe the scene. So,
around this time, Napoleon famously said, "Give me mastery over the Channel for 6 hours, and I'll be master of the world." And so he believed that literally that was all it would take, would be the home fleet's absence from the English Channel for 6 hours would be all that would be enough. And you look at what forces the British had to oppose him at that time. They were trying to build a big canal across southern England to basically just section off that part of the country. So if the French overran it, they could defend. but the guys they hired to do it were crooks, and so it was like nowhere near done at that point. They had like 8 miles done. They were trying to build these fortresses along the coast, and those weren't up to snuff either. They had under 100,000 British regulars on the island, and they had a huge number of these militia forces, but they were a mess. They were not well trained. A lot of them didn't even have firearms. They were armed with pikes. This was like a big scandal in Parliament when it came out that, we've been raising all these militia forces. We're safe. Don't worry about it. And then it came out that, oh yeah, these guys don't even have guns.
Yeah. How'd they go for the crappies at Vinegar Hill? Pikes don't really work too much in this era.
Right, and even if they did have guns, the track record in the early phase of the Napoleonic Wars, the track record of old regime armies against the kind of reformed, built back better French army is just abysmal. Especially when you've got, like, the British Army, they're totally untested. They don't know how to cope with this, and the terrain is not defensible in southern England. The green and pleasant land, as the song says. And so, it's hard to imagine the British resisting in any really serious way. I think that would have been a laugher, as they say in British soccer. It would have been, the Grande Armée just sweeping up the country. The British were really right to focus so much of their security on the Navy, because the chances of holding off the French on the land once they landed was just... again, there's just no way to picture it, really.
So they take out England. How does that affect world history? We have Napoleonic England, Napoleonic France united into one power base. The dream of the 14th century accomplished. What goes next?
Well, I think it's hard to imagine the French being defeated after that. This is before Austerlitz. This is before Jena Auerstedt. So this is when Napoleon Napoleon and his army are at the height of their powers. And without British assistance, it's hard to, look at how poorly the great powers did against him with British assistance in the coming 2 years. So imagine without that, how badly they would have, been destroyed. And then you're left with a world where, everyone west of modern-day Poland basically is under French domination. Very easy to imagine Napoleon cutting a deal with the Russians. As I mentioned earlier, that had always been his goal to, let's find the line where my stuff separates from your stuff and then call it a day and be friends. And, without the British complicating things, it did happen in our universe, just with the complication of the Russians having this relationship with Britain, which ultimately resulted in the agreement being destroyed. There wouldn't be that pressure in this world, so I think they Russia and France sign some version of the Treaty of Tilsit, as they did in our world, and that sets the stage for the next period of European history, with Western Europe under French domination and Eastern Europe under the control of the Tsar, and that's that.
And that brings us back then to an inevitable American-French conflict, right?
Right.
That were
yeah, because I got to imagine that a lot of those British upper class would not have accepted their country being dominated by the French and would have left.
They'd be like
the U.S., Canada,
like
the Caribbean.
Exile. Yeah, they'd be like a rump exile elite, constantly calling for war against the French in the middle of the 19th century. Not only that, a French that maybe would have been more liberal in certain regards. So then how do you see that playing out? If again, Germany is basically pacified. Britain is basically pacified, though its elite flees to the dominions or former colonies and forms like an upper class there, a very powerful proto-lobbying group. What does that mean for the United States and France over the course of the 19th century? Do you get a civil war in the United States? Do you get the United States trying to do a great power conflict much earlier? Matt, what do you think?
It's easy to imagine the Civil War happening earlier. There was already a secessionist movement of New Englanders responding to the Anglo-American conflict that the Democrats focused on during their terms. It's very easy to, and we had the quasi-war under the Adams administration. It's easy to see those interests persisting and sharpening to the point where that sectional fracture point that was built into the American constitutional order gets tested much earlier and much more dramatically.
I also think actually you would see in a not dissimilar dynamic in a French-dominated Europe. I think there would still be, in our universe, big sort of status quo upending wars always create kind of a reaction down the road. For us, we had the 60s after World War II. We had the 1848 revolutions after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and I think there would have been a similar state of affairs in a French-dominated Europe. And in our 1848, the rebels, there were sort of two animating forces: the nationalism and liberalism. With a sort of liberal empire, cosmopolitan and pluralistic as Napoleon's empire was, maybe the forces rising up to oppose that in the post-war, unrest are nationalist and conservative. And maybe there's kind of almost like a proto-fascist springtime of the nations in 1848, with kind of right-wing romantic German nationalists, trying to topple this decadent frog empire.
That's true, but you would also have that working class proto-socialist current that is in 1848 too. And if you have this cosmopolitan liberal empire, could you not also see the rise of a more coherent and culturally connected and autonomous socialist resistance in this same moment then?
And there is precedent for that because, that is how the French revolutionaries dealt with uprisings from the right, is by empowering the left. It's not impossible to imagine that maybe, Napoleon III obviously would have had a very different life if his uncle had been successful. Maybe Napoleon III, in the moment of crisis in his version of 1848, decides he's got to arm the workers, to put down the revolutionaries. That could be a very interesting counterfactual.
And to me, what's most interesting to that counterfactual is it raises the question of 1914, right? What if the workers have decades more of being integrated amongst what in our world became national spaces, but in their world are much looser. There's more freedom of movement. There's easier freedom of movement. There's novel institutions that are created. Maybe there's sorts of liberal educational institutions in Germany that didn't really exist in quite the same way. And so you get a working class that recognizes itself as such, partially because there's just more communication between a French and German working class. I mean, as you guys know, Eugen Weber's famous book From Peasants into Frenchmen, he argues that like in France, some of these languages were not mutually intelligible. But what if you have like a mutual intelligibility in every sense of the word develop over the 19th century? I think you see a much more viable socialist movement much earlier.
Well, and socialism is, I think, more amenable. I mean, obviously no capitalists are amenable to socialism. That's kind of a silly line of argument. But the style of thinking of sort of French managed capitalism is more, has more crossover with socialist thought than the pure laissez-faire Anglo-American style capitalism does. So again, it's one of those things that's such a big, broad question. It's almost hard to pick one direction to take it in.
Well, it's interesting to me because it raises this fundamental issue. In our actual world, the forces of the bourgeoisie basically tilt right. What if there's a world where they like tilt left? How much would that actually change things? And they would have to tilt left to keep down the sort of romantic, reactionary German nationalists that almost certainly would have arisen in the 19th century.
And there is, we do see echoes of that in our world, where like for instance, if you look at like French mobilization in World War I, is very much in that wheelhouse of sort of center left bourgeoisie, defend the republic from the barbaric Teutonic autocracy. Maybe, who knows? Maybe in that world, kind of the Great Crusade is against the Russians. Maybe that détente between Napoleonic Western Europe and Russian-dominated Eastern Europe breaks down, and maybe over Poland, which would be an outstanding issue in that world.
And Marx said that it would be like one thing that would have organized the working class towards self-consciousness and power would have been a war with Russia. like he endorsed that in 1848. Like the way to get the German nation to not allow its revolutionary moment to pass was to push forward for a conflict with Russia that would have, in Marx's mind, would have pulled the German nation headlong into a socialism of necessity, basically.
In the same way that the war with Austria did in the French Revolution.
And if you could have that play out with the same social forces being unleashed.
Right.
Any final thoughts on Napoleon or hinge points with Napoleon before we call it a day?
Yeah, he's my number one pick for a guy that I look at and I'm like, man, that is the ultimate 5-tool player. And I just imagine if you could just have him on your team, at certain key moments, like, damn.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those, build your team for $20. Even if he's $15, you pick Napoleon.
You absolutely pick Napoleon. I
also just think, he's such a perfect, I almost chuckled when you sent me the outline for this and there were so many topics, because normally you guys tackle like one. But that's the thing with Napoleon, is that he was, great man theory of history is discredited for very good reason. But if there ever was someone for whom it was true, it was Napoleon. He just was so good at putting himself in the key position. And so there are so many different hinge points that revolve around him, because he was in a relatively, extremely unusual position in world history of being able to just make decisions about things like this. And so you can picture all these, situations where if he'd just gone the other way, things could have been different.
And he was unable to, because, none of us know what we don't know, Yep. And like the one that strikes me is the one that, from the top of the episode, the most plausible alternative. If he allies with Toussaint, sends the letter. And we know that allying with Toussaint would have been, not just in hindsight, the right decision. At the time, there was plenty of evidence in front of Napoleon's face that there was no way to reimpose French rule towards the end of reimposing slavery onto Saint Domingue. It could not be done. The British had proven it.
Yeah. Well, he sent someone to Haiti to, report on this question, who told him our only shot is Toussaint. That was his own official envoy's read on the situation.
And so what was on the other side of the ledger? Like, yes, Josephine was the daughter of planters, and they had that fucking that lobby in his ear. But at the end of the day, it's racism. Mm-hmm. It's just he cannot take the idea of coming to some sort of agreement among equals with someone like Toussaint. It offended him at a level that warped his vision, and that's why he's such an amazingly compelling figure, because you have in him the full tragedy of humanity, how you can have access to pretty much limitless gifts and the ability to recognize opportunity, but we are all shaped by forces that we can never fully comprehend and understand their impact on our decision-making and understanding of the world.
Yeah, and Napoleon had been an abolitionist in his youth. It goes to show you, the man who probably arguably did the most for the cause of slavery in modern times, Napoleon Bonaparte, had been, as an idealistic young man, a committed opponent of slavery. It goes to show you that, those convictions don't amount to much if you don't hold on to them when the rubber meets the road.
And on that tragic note, Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
In a world where points depend on hinges,
there are hinge points inside us all.
History on a Segway.
It's overdetermined.
We are the points that our hinges have been seeking.
What this podcast asks is, what if?
Agriculture, fail or epic win?
What if it was Johnny Mango Pit?
What if the Ottomans had AK-47s?
Maybe climate change was a good idea.
What if the Ottomans had lightsabers?
What if the buffalo killed us?
What if Santa Claus was real, like an actual guy who gave presents every year? This is Hinge Points.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Hinge Points. I'm Danny Bessner, normally of the American Prestige podcast, but I am here with my buddy Matt Christman to talk about another Hinge Point. You've already heard us talk about a lot of different things, from Doggerland to Martin Luther to other fun issues in history. And today we're going to focus on an issue that's a little bit more recent, and that is, in particular, the 1960 election. And specifically, what if Richard Milhouse Nixon won that election over John Fitzgerald Kennedy? And we are excited to be joined by Noah Kulwin of the Blowback podcast. Noah, thanks so much for joining us today, man.
Hey, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
No worries. So the way that we're doing this, we're kind of starting with the world as it actually is, so we could understand how things might have changed. So Noah, why don't you set the scene about what JFK actually did, and what are some of the important hinge points that we're going to be talking about today?
Right. So JFK, listeners should recall, he didn't really have that much of a tenure in office. 1,000 days, as Arthur Schlesinger famously termed it in his book. And so the accomplishments that he did make were often not really these, big legislative or administrative achievements that we remember decades later, because his administration didn't have the juice to get any of that kind of stuff through. So
You wouldn't listen to LBJ. He was right there. He was telling them what to do. And they're
So
like,
what
sure, Grandpa.
Yeah. So what you have instead is more of a set of positions that are substantial evolutions from the previous occupant of the White House, and that will effectively determine the trajectory of the 60s vis-a-vis the federal government in a number of key areas, in terms of labor racketeering in the Justice Department, in terms of civil rights, and in terms of, I would really strongly argue, the, broadly speaking, what we would consider the quasi-confrontational posture that was adopted by the executive branch. The fact that the executive branch over the course of the 60s felt, yes, compelled to wage a Cold War, but as was the case during the 1950s, was ultimately a force handcuffed to a military whose goals and interests were often strongly divergent. And so the question then becomes, in 1960, were one man, a different man, to win that White House spot, I suppose, would the coalition, would the powers of play have broken in some different fashion? Would it have gone down different?
And maybe before we even get into the hinge point, Matt, why don't you tell us who is Richard Milhouse Nixon? What social forces does Dick Nixon represent in 1960? One of your favorite topics.
Richard Nixon is the revenge of Main Street. He is the middle class subject, really, confronting the reality of competing for power in the context of America's class and the world's class apocalypse of World War II. And the American middle class that comes out of that is in a constant churning state of anxiety, resentment, fear of falling, and self-loathing at one's lack of acceptance by the powers that are both repulsive and also the only sources of power or affirmation in life. So Nixon, the son of a struggling grocer from Whittier, California, who had to go to his local Whittier college because he couldn't afford or get a scholarship or be brought in as a fucking legacy like John F. Kennedy. If anyone wants to laugh, anybody ever wants to laugh, look up John F. Kennedy's admissions essay to Harvard. If you want to chuckle, it might as well have been written in fucking crayon.
It's like he was a fourth grader. It's a goddamn shame.
To Harvard. It is a good school and would give me a good liberal arts education. So he had to go to Whittier, where he had to form the Orthogonians because the Franklins wouldn't let him in, and spends World War II making money at a poker table in a rear echelon supply depot in the Pacific. Comes home, gets his Navy uniform, sells his soul to a pack of jackals from Orange County, the real estate fascists who are going to end up funding this entire anti-New Deal movement that is going to emerge and become politically articulate in the coming decades. He goes up to the Bay Area and swamps poor Jerry Voorhees, a classic fellow traveler, useful idiot style, do-gooding liberal who was effectively an ally to the American Communist Party without knowing it. bye-bye, Jerry. And he becomes representative, uses the Red Scare to can't come to power, becomes a senator at an incredibly young age, really mirrors JFK in his ascent, but again, from this churning, anxious, resentful position.
The
And then he
frontier
spends,
also with Nixon.
he is able to secure the 1952 Republican nomination for vice president by spending the train ride from California to the RNC, convincing Earl Weaver to support Nixon for the president's or for Eisenhower against Taft, and then his reward for that is the vice presidency, where he spends 8 years being held at arm's length by a Eisenhower who looks down on him as a grubby little politician.
And there's a lot, there is so much to back up Eisenhower's intuition about Nixon, even at that time and at that stage of his career, because one of my favorite examples of sort of Nixon cronyism, to speak to the power base he represents, was that he was deeply in bed with the real estate lobby, and especially the S&Ls, who were really, really critical to encouraging the right kind of population growth and real estate development in Southern California. And one of Nixon's last acts, it was involved as a very controversial measure as a senator to get involved to kill public housing in Los Angeles, which I mainly bring up because public housing was one of the big issues where Nixon and Kennedy did diverge, and where Kennedy, with the New Frontier in 1961, was actually able to introduce something that Nixon might have been straight up opposed to, at least on domestic policy, in terms of where you can see like a straight up plus or negative on a single definable issue that also goes right to the heart of, the way Nixon operates, because Joe Crail, a figure I've written about, a California S&L executive, was one of the first donors to the Nixon Slush Fund and one of the leaders of the campaign to kill public housing in Los Angeles, a campaign with which Nixon assisted gratefully.
So while Eisenhower held Nixon at arm's length and kind of undercut him a few times, Nixon never forgave him for having the Fed sort of allow, and in fact kind of encourage, a recession to cool down the economy in the late 50s, and that he blamed partially on his defeat. But one thing Eisenhower did give him at the end of his second term was control, was White House, was executive control of the task force to overthrow the new Castro regime in Cuba. So whereas Kennedy has the Bay of Pigs plan kind of dropped on his lap when he is inaugurated, Nixon, before he even would have become president, is already deeply invested in this project and has a proprietary relationship to it, which I think means that if we assume a few thousand dead people change their minds in Illinois and he becomes president, means that we can sort of assume that if he were president, I really do think he would have done what he said after words to other people many times he would have done, which is greenlight a bombing campaign. And if that didn't do it, if that didn't get the rebels off of the beachhead, then send in the fucking Marines. And I think he would have done all of that. The question is, okay, what then happens?
Right. Okay. A couple of things. One thing that I always find interesting is that Nancy Pelosi is currently in the same congressional district as Nixon was in Northern California. A fun little historical fact there. So let's say that what Matt said is right. A few dead people vote differently, and Nixon wins a 60 election. And what Matt was referring to was the Bay of Pigs. So Noah, you just did a thing on Cuba. What actually happens during the Bay of Pigs? What decision does Kennedy make? And then what decision might Nixon make?
So I think that Matt made the point, made the correct first point, which is that basically the Bay of Pigs was dropped on Kennedy's lap. Although he's famous for saying in its aftermath that defeat, what is it? Victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. So that comes out of the disaster at the Bay of Pigs, where he's basically saying, yep, I got to take responsibility for it. But, everybody knows that this was something that had been developed for years because of the, years-long campaign against Castro that sort of reaches, a sort of 2-year zenith, let's say, beginning around when Kennedy takes office, actually. And the really nutty part of it is that the plan, even though it was dropped on Kennedy's lap, was a terrible plan. There wasn't really it did not have any realistic chance of succeeding because Allen Dulles, the historical evidence I would argue indicates that he believed that one of two things. He believed one or both rather. He believed that there would be a successful assassination of Castro and key members of the Cuban leadership on the island prior to the invasion, and that would create an opening for even a shitty invasion to work, which is not dissimilar to what happened in Guatemala in 1954.
So were they basically like crossing their fingers that the mafia would get the job done there?
Well, they say, it's like. It's interesting that you say crossing their fingers because it's like functionally that's what they were doing, but in their heads they may have believed like, oh, we're getting him done. We're getting him this time.
We've had talks. These Italian gentlemen have the whole thing under control.
The Italian element is secure, sir. The Italian element, yeah. Like they thought they had it totally locked down, the whole thing. And then the other big problem, that they had, or rather that Dulles was relying on and that didn't come through, was that if things didn't go right, that Kennedy would pull the trigger on a wider invasion. And
you would have to for the prestige.
Exactly.
Think of the prestige.
And this is a very this was the wrong assumption for a number of reasons. And ultimately the invasion fails, on the ground because they don't have air support. The boats aren't right. Ammunition
Kennedy
falls
refuses
in the water.
air support. That's the big choice is that Kennedy basically says.
I mean, the air support bit is even if he had supplied it, it's not really clear that it would have helped ultimately. However, the memory becomes, and something that is, relevant to the Kennedy-Nixon argument, is that Kennedy in the 1960 campaign had run to the right of Richard Nixon on Cuba. He had basically, in a debate, said, Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, they're as powerful as ever. We're gonna, it's like, and what has Nixon done? Whereas Nixon, he's like, that goddamn Kennedy and his Jews, like, da-da-da-da-da. Like, they know that I've done stuff, but I can't say it because, Dulles briefed them, da-da-da. And the secret honor, if you want to hear that whole rant. But this difference in tack, Kennedy decides not to pull the trigger, not to give the air support, make it clear that he's not going to go through with it. And Nixon's argument, as Matt has said, was that actually, no, you have to fight communism everywhere, and you got it. We should have sent in the Marines. We should have sealed the deal. And I'm not sure that.
So does Nixon actually do that? So that's something.
That's it's a great.
So this is the real question. Like there's that decision point, right? Let's say the invasion begins as it does in our timeline, where the invaders aren't doing especially well. They're getting railed by the defenses in Cuba. Nixon is faced with this choice to send in air support. Does he do it? And if he does, what does that mean? Do we get a Vietnam-style quagmire? Does the invasion actually succeed? Does that actually lead people on the island to rise up against Castro? The mafia did have a lot of capital invested in Cuba and had for decades at that point. What do you think happens?
Or
Nixon, right? Or nuclear war. So what do you guys think happens if Nixon makes the choice? Let's say he makes the choice for air support.
I would guess that if Nixon were to make the choice for air support, the first thing that would happen and would really be the first test is the diplomatic interventions. In 1950, when Truman, and this is the recent precedent for international crisis at that moment, Truman is, he mentions and just affirms that he's the guy who drops atomic bombs, and Clement Attlee is already on a plane. He's already on the phone, and he's, our best friend, and they have troops in Korea. So, and he's saying, shut the fuck up, Harry. So the thing that Kennedy never had, that the historical record does not show that Kennedy really had to deal with, was that there would be a meaningful big question of I should actually give air cover. And it was never really that dramatic of a question. The record seems to kind of indicate. I think in the case of Nixon, it would be, I am not so sure that he would have actually continued through with such a large military operation if all of a sudden everybody at the UN and in the West is on the phone with him saying, if you do this, the rest of the world will not respect you. They will think of you as the Nazis. And because at that moment, the idea of American prestige and freedom as, outweighing its economic power, I just don't feel that they could have. I think that Nixon would have been more conscious of it just simply by being the guy in the chair. It's a heavily moderating influence.
So then if he drops the bombs, I think we all would say, even if that happened, that still does not make the Pay It Big successful. Like you're still going to have them get rolled up from the beachhead because they just don't. It was a bad plan, poorly executed, and insufficient to begin with.
It would be a fear strategy. The idea,
Okay,
and that's,
but
yeah.
But let's say we also have to think about staffing, because Noah, I think you're right to a certain degree. There is a sort of liberal internationalist moderating influence that Kennedy himself embodies. But what if Nixon's on the phone with Curtis LeMay? What if Nixon's on the phone with these other strategic air command people who really want to demonstrate that you actually can use atomic bombs and they don't always have to be used to end a war?
They're good for your teeth.
Right. Maybe it's not impossible, at least from my perspective, to imagine a world where Nixon does the air support fails, and then he's talking to Strategic Air Command, and they're like, okay, tactical nukes. Why not use tactical nukes?
I don't disagree at all. To me, the thing that feels like, and I think it's very possible.
Because Nixon, one more thing I want to add, because Nixon would also want to separate himself from Eisenhower. Because Eisenhower was so consciously not the guy who's not going to do rollback. And Nixon resented Eisenhower. He would want to shore up himself, particularly with the generals, particularly because you have someone in the Republican Party who's not a general like Eisenhower, right? So he's more apt.
He might split the baby and then do the invasion. So it's like, yes, if the question is just let the invasion die or drop a nuke, I am at the end of the day a human being enmeshed in human institutions, and that is a bridge too far, especially when you consider that this would be a Nixon who would be like 5 years less crazy than the one who became president. Because, the thing in his head, it was, it's time release as it is in anyone. So he's like more together in 1960.
Well, and also, I do think that, again, like, one of the things that's also hard, I think, to people, like, anti-communism and Nazism have in common the, like, tremendous ability for people to rationalize stuff that they know is bullshit, but because they believe that the outcome is worth it. So they're like, yeah, listen, like, I know that guy who says that, like, Jesus is coming next Tuesday and that, like, all the Jews have to, like, give their blood is, he's a little bit crazy, but he's also, like, the Clark County Republican Party chair. So we got to listen to him. And so, like, that's part of it. And in the case of Nixon, this is something where I am pretty much persuaded by, like, the basic Rick Perlstein argument about the guy's character, in terms of that, like, he never really could fully reject that. There's a reason Kissinger was the guy running his foreign policy as opposed to somebody further to the right, because ultimately he viewed himself as, at best, right, an incredibly competent, like, servant and new legacy within, the pantheon of American leaders, and that doesn't include crazies. And that's, something that ultimately is, I would argue, like, part of what leads to his downfall, surrounding Watergate many, many years later. Okay,
so then we take off the board two possibilities. They do the bombing, America tips its hand, which happened anyway. That didn't work. We say, oops. Then you get probably the similar thing. You get a Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's assume that it's similarly as in our world doesn't do nuke. Or he drops the nuke in some way out of that, and either one of those, we're kind of done talking.
Well, I think
at least about this specific thing. But the one that is left then is, what if he decides, okay, we're going to send in an American peacekeeping operation. We cloak it in the language of a police action. We say, well, the way we did in the Dominican Republic 10 years later,
Korea
5 years,
2.0.
like in 1965, and then basically dare the Soviets to then escalate to nukes. And Khrushchev would not have done that. I think we can all agree that Khrushchev would not have, in that situation, willingly launched a first strike.
Well, I would also say that the other thing to consider is that the way Nixon conceived of it, and a lot of conservatives conceived about the debate, was that, there were two, like, Cuba was, if anything, like, and this is, it actually is kind of helpful the way the CIA organized their divisions about it. Like, in the Kennedy years, they would, they created, like, a whole Cuba desk within the CIA, and your CIA stations all over the world would have a Cuba desk officer. And so Cuba, in a sense, like, you could forget the geographic location. It became like a whole other specific front in the Cold War. So, okay, if that's one front, what are the other fronts? And if the Cold War is this global war, as Nixon and others conceived it, it, where, when you apply pressure here and ease pressure here, what are the things that maybe if we ratchet the heat up in Cuba that we could get away with in, say, Berlin or in Vietnam? And so that, to me, is some of where I think the Cuban Missile Crisis becomes an opportunity to see, we call it a Cuban Missile Crisis in part because Americans were never apprised popularly of the fact that it had these global geopolitical implications, and that those were ultimately the considerations moderating the Americans' hands most strongly. And that, which was, the idea that, like, if the Americans move on Cuba, the Soviets move in Berlin. Because, East Berlin, or Berlin, sorry, let me rephrase, Berlin, rather, is like, 60 miles or 100 miles into East Germany. And so there was the very real idea, that the U.S. actually, when it came time push come to shove, that the U.S. would actually have, the Soviet Union had more leverage than the U.S. even at its most fundamentalist individuals was, ever really willing to acknowledge.
And also, when we're talking about the Bay of Pigs, that's happening in the midst of the Second Berlin Crisis, where it's just like this liminal period where Khrushchev has made several threats about maybe, just taking West Berlin. And so that I think does legitimately function as a moderating influence. The only difference is the question is Nixon enough of a psychopath effectively to be like, it's the Caribbean is the American lake, and my status with the military and particularly the Air Force depends on me doing something here. I think Kennedy is able to say no in a way because he has a relatively somewhat oppositional stance, particularly his staff, towards the uniformed military, where Nixon would have a totally different power base. And that leads to my next question. So, Noah, maybe you can describe, what does the CIA think of Kennedy, and how is that different if Nixon is president?
So I think that the CIA, if anything, looked at Kennedy really favorably, and their antagonism to him only really began and was not complete, by the way. The CIA shouldn't be described as a monolith. It was even as an institution with its own differing power centers and so on. But on the whole, they began pretty enamored with it. Allen Dulles favored Kennedy over Nixon, in part not just because the CIA thought of themselves as the most effective and cosmopolitan and engaged with the world of all the major national security agencies. I think that they really would have probably viewed Kennedy as, hey, listen, if Nixon doesn't hold on for another 4 years, which he probably won't, because historically that's not really, the successor to a two-term president is often, not somebody who in their own right is able to succeed and extend the project. And so I think that there would have probably been, you could argue that the Cuba crisis may have just come 4 years, in 1965 or something, as opposed to 62, after Kennedy wins in his first presidential election, after Nixon loses, because he, the economy is okay, but it, there is some inflation beginning to crop up, which was the case by the mid-60s, that is also beginning to undergird the social discontent that is beginning to pour out across the country. Seeing or imagining a Republican president in the beginning of the 60s for the civil rights movement would have been fucking crazy. And that would have probably been another really powerful moderating or difficult influence for any Republican, president looking to court a Southern political base for the future, which Nixon political strategists were already hoping to do. It's hard to, it's interesting.
I think we got to pause for a second here because I want to hear what you guys think about Nixon's state of mind in the early 1960s if he doesn't lose the election. What do you think he's like if he wins this election? Because I do think the Nixon of the early 1970s placed in the early 1960s is radical and makes relatively radical moves.
Oh yeah, no. If you have Nixon, just the guy, if you just transported him from his second term as president to from 73 to the early 60s, he's pressing the button, baby. Bye bye. We're done for him.
Totally.
He's absolutely pressing the button. He didn't he have to, it is on record that he actually did call in a nuclear fucking attack on North Korea, that he had to have his general's counterman, right? That happened? Or is that just alleged?
I'm not sure, honestly. Let me see.
This is in the archives. that he got rip shit during Watergate, and I think it was the Maya Gez incident.
I've heard about this. I'm not sure, but I have heard about this. My guess is that if I heard about it, it's probably real. Yeah.
But I think, yeah, you get him. But a early '60s Nixon, who has only ever won an election, has never faced, a hostile, frothingly negative public the way that Nixon had to endure during his presidency. I think has more to lose in every sense, and therefore is going to play things much more cautiously than the Nixon that we had in our world.
So then this is interesting. So what Nixon is often famously referred to as the last New Deal president. So maybe we could talk a little bit about domestic policy before we maybe turn to Vietnam, which I'm curious what you guys think would happen. So how do you think Nixon is different on domestic policy? Noah, you were talking about the civil rights movement. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so I think, Nixon is sort of like your classic, like Bigfoot Bjornson, Southern California fascist, who is aligned primarily with real estate interests, big business as far as, manufacturing concerns, defense industrialists. It's a very, it's a fairly, new money crowd as far as these things go. A lot of people in a fairly new power base that is coming into being in the post-war period. And so as far as the civil rights, fights are concerned, fights over housing, and busing will ultimately, these are the, you can see the latent configurations that will become much more relevant later on when he's president, and that will, making up the silent majority, propelling him into power. And, in the case of Kennedy, the Democratic Party is, there is this long-term, issue where the Democratic Party's cosmopolitan, union, socially liberal interests can no longer abide being in the same part of the same, political party as the South. And so, the way I see it is that by the time 1960 rolls around, the trajectory is kind of largely understood, or at least felt, if not so explicitly articulated, to, the party mandarins for both Democrats and Republicans. But the way in which, these politicians individually each try to thread that needle of what the future is going to look like. And ultimately, if they, as individuals, come to, personally try to shepherd through civil rights legislation in the fashion that, if we're weighing it against history as it happened, which is LBJ doing it after the death of John F. Kennedy, and sort of acknowledging that he may be or that rather he is sending the Democratic Party into a tailspin. But it's for the Great Society, and it's to sustain the Vietnam War and so on. If that's sort of what we're weighing it against, then, I think that the way that the civil rights policies unfolded in the early 1960s with Nixon as president, I mean, it probably we would have seen a lot of the unresolved, or what, would have become really serious issues of inequality and poverty that were growing in the 1950s, get even more serious. I mean, it would have been really difficult for America to stomach a story of selling the fact that, yeah, they have this beautiful interstate system, but also they have slums that look like Latin America's. I think that would have been the challenge that Nixon would have confronted. And would there have been a capitalist solution to that, a kind of, neoliberal, but 20 years earlier kind of policy initiative that could have made that work? I'm not sure. I think Nixon may have ultimately been forced to do, as he was in the case of price controls in the 70s, to resort to something that, people may have called socialistic, but he probably, like Truman, would have found a way to call it national security measures.
Okay, I got a real curveball for you guys.
Hit me.
I just thought of this. So we imagine Nixon in the White House dealing with domestic issues. Let's say that Cuba does not cause a conflagration, and we're still enmeshed there to a greater or lesser degree than we are now. But everything else, we're still dealing with. There's still nominally normal politics going on, and that means you have the civil rights movement, the civil rights issue becoming the dominant domestic question, and putting huge fractures, as you said, on these party alliances. And at that point, the black vote was not united in any sense. It was essentially a tip ball between the parties. I believe that Kennedy won the black vote in '60, but very narrowly, and he was the first Democrat to do so since I think Truman. And that meant that there was like a sense that this black vote was up for grabs. What if instead of accelerating the Southern strategy that he eventually employed as president and trying to break off the white South, he instead tried to propose a capitalist program of domestic spending and rights extension, broken away from the Democratic Party and the labor movement, and pitched directly towards the black middle class, which was the activist engine of the civil rights movement in the first place.
But then you get to the big, well, there's the big wedge of the Nixon that is the interesting, X factor here, I think, which is the Hoffa and the fact that Nixon actually did have specific union allies that he would cultivate, because business unionism back in those days meant that you could be conservative and you could work with, I have some right-wing pamphlets that are printed by Joe Crail, that right-wing executive who donated to Nixon, and the pamphlets that I have all have union bugs on them. They're all made by union printers and so on. And it's just to say probably they're more union printers than they're necessarily Republican. But point being that there were some, there was a more openness, I think, to unionism that would have been one of the big questions that sort of comes into play here. How would that Nixon, do you think, have responded to the union question?
And ironically, that might have also even more firmly entrenched the New Deal state. Instead of in the 60s, if you have a Republican president entrenching the New Deal state, he could be basically the liberal Bill Clinton, which is an interesting thing to think about.
And maybe you see Nixon as the guy who synthesized the New Deal state rather than the one who kind of was the harbinger of its destruction, because he took a fucking just jackhammer to its social basis.
I think that would have been really tough, and sort of the only way that you can get away with sort of stripping apart the New Deal is by maintaining the Cold War. And for the Cold War to be maintained, that's how Vietnam emerges as this almost historically predetermined locale for America to wage a conflict. And there becomes, I guess, this very there had once been a wing of the Republican Party, the Robert Tafts, who said, look, we want laissez-faire economics, and we don't want to just have this crazy military that makes the laissez-faire economics possible. And that was shut out of the party basically, by the early 50s, even before 52. And so by 1960, if that whole, kind of restraining impulse is gone, it does feel to me that a lot of what we just ended up seeing in the 80s is, you're seeing a lot of the potentialities for that just to happen 20 years earlier, for there to instead be a, sort of aggressive posture about developing new markets and, creating new markets and using that language and so on. And, appearing willing to back up those desires, both by the force of guns, yes, but also ultimately in the 80s, what was super crucial was that the IMF and World Bank began doing, say, structural adjustments. And were those institutions, would that kind of coercion necessary for the Cold War to be waged in the way that it was in its later years? Could that have been possible decades earlier? I'm not so sure. So it sort of goes back to how aggressive would a Nixon have necessarily felt empowered to be in that situation?
And I think we need to talk a little bit then about what is his relationship, or what do you imagine his relationship being to the security state? And let's talk specifically about the uniformed military and then the CIA. We kind of got away from that question. So Noah, you were saying that initially the CIA, which of course can't be viewed as a monolith, but let's just broadly refer to it there, was more for Kennedy than Nixon. So let's say it's 61, Nixon is in office. How does he relate to the uniformed military, and how does he relate to the CIA?
Nixon, he loves uniformed boys. He loves their, he has an admiration for them, yes. He is also not one of them, and that he is not one of them, but is, sort of from their world, always gives him a kind of interesting adjacency. I think in the case of 1960, he is so much their guy for not just the anti-communism, but also, again, the defense contractors who are, they are the biggest employers, some of the biggest and most heavy political muscle. They are, involved in, pamphleteering anti-communism and trying to get their employees, like sustaining the total war mobilization and consciousness well beyond World War II, well beyond Korea, and, into the 1960s. And I think that, like, that sense of, like, that, like, the U.S. and the world is sort of in this constant, never-ending crisis, is, like, the biggest thing that Nixon and the uniformed military shared. That, and that's the, a sense of, it's a good sort of, I think, archetypal model, actually, for how reactionary bureaucrat and politicians tend to work with the military. It's hand in glove, but there are points of dissension, particularly because ultimately the politician is constrained by factors and considerations that the military leader is not, definitionally.
So that's a good summary. How do you think he'd relate to the CIA?
The CIA viewed Nixon, he's an anti-communist friend, etc., but they butted heads over the Cuba stuff because Nixon wanted results and he didn't get them, and the CIA wasn't delivering them. And also, Nixon didn't trust them. Nixon had a general who was on his staff, who was like his CIA liaison, who, like, the CIA, I think his name was Cushman, and, like, the CIA just, like, totally, Cushbomb, and they just totally, marginalized him, and Nixon fucking hated him. Nixon hated the CIA for treating as, like, he viewed them as rivals. And then, ultimately, however, when he becomes president, he has a very different relationship with them by them. Jefferson Morley literally wrote the book on it. And he sort of shows that, like, because the CIA as an institution is both set up to serve the president, and its access to the president is what gives it protection, into doing all these very legally dicey things, like killing people and running covert wars and stuff. Nixon ultimately and the CIA did have a pretty fruitful relationship up until they didn't. And so I think that, there's, like, Nixon was operationally probably much more in tune with the CIA, but in a kind of attitudinal sense about, it being kind of gauche to, talk about, the communists and how, communism is phony baloney and stuff like that. It was a little bit too crass for them. It was, it wasn't their style.
So then this brings us naturally to Vietnam. What does Nixon do in Vietnam? So Kennedy, obviously, there's lots of arguments about what he would have done, but what he does do is that he does approve, for example, the assassination of Ngo Diem. He does indicate that the United States is going to continue to intervene in Vietnam. He does send more advisors there. There's arguments about whether he would have done the escalation in 64, 65. But what do you guys think Nixon does as Vietnamese, South Vietnamese politics in particular begins to go haywire in the early 1960s? Does Nixon just say, forget it? Does Nixon say, I'm going to escalate? I'm going to send troops there? What does he do in 62, 63, 64?
I think it kind of depends on what's going on in Cuba. If you have sort of a status quo ante situation, Castro's still in power, the U.S. probably at that point enjoined from interfering with him anymore to de-escalate from the nuclear confrontation that inevitably followed. Then I think you see something similar to what happened under Kennedy and Johnson, this dribble of advisors until the advisors couldn't be defended. Then you got to send the troops to defend the advisors, and then you got to send troops to defend the troops, and then you got Operation Dart and all that. I think you'd see something similar, maybe a little accelerated timetable, but a similar, because I think Nixon had a similar insecurity relative to the military state that as Johnson did. Like Kennedy's big superpower, and the thing that got him killed was his noblesse oblige and his aristocratic confidence. And Nixon, like Johnson, didn't really have that. But if there's an invasion, say, like a marine invasion of Cuba that is like bogged down there, then I think that's where the focus is. And maybe Vietnam is sort of kept on a back burner to an extent. While like the show of force country, the set piece country of the Cold War becomes Cuba, 90 miles away rather than Vietnam.
Well, I think that, that last point you're making about 90 miles is kind of one of the key things there, because I don't think that the U.S. could actually sustain a war in that kind of, 90 miles from Miami, et cetera, unless it was seeking to, win it totally. Because remember, the reason that that the Americans are also trying to wage a war there is that they have all these goddamn Cubans breathing down their necks whom they've recruited and mobilized, and who ideally are going to be the ones who run the country once they succeed militarily. So there is also like this force that, like, if they're going to do Cuba, that they like go through with it in that way. I think that Vietnam is sort of like helpful as kind of also looking at like where, when you look at the state of the American military more generally, like, and this is also where a lot of the companies that Nixon's, initial constituents, worked for and so on, like McDonnell Douglas or something, they're the ones who make all these airplanes and air power and bombs and, bomb components and radar mapping and sensors and so on, that are ultimately these technologies that are incredibly useful for the kind of war we waged in Vietnam, which is, by and large, like unfathomable amounts of ordnance. Dropping napalm and bombs. And that is the kind of thing like that we couldn't have really done that to Cuba for a number of different reasons, but that we were able to do it in Vietnam, that we were able to do it in Cambodia, like, to me sort of shows that, like, that was actually, like, there would have been a really strong incentive to have, like, picked up where the French had left off in Vietnam, even though Cuba may have had more opportunity for success than it would have under Kennedy, so to speak.
No, that's a very good point, because during the Vietnam War, a lot of people would argue against it by saying, why are we fighting people 3,000 miles away? And the answer is because that's precisely where we had to fight them. Like, if we're going to do this high ordnance, high intensity conflict, it basically has to be halfway around the world, or else it risks escalating too much.
Exactly. And this is also, part of the legacy of, like, America's imperial project begins not, the first American imperial project is like the genocide and dispossession of the Native Americans. The second, like more meaningful one, I would argue that, could basically get lumped in with the, after Mexico, I suppose, would be, when we get to the Philippines, an effort led by future Supreme Commander of the Allied, or the father of future Supreme Commander of Asia Pacific, Douglas MacArthur. You have this brutal, crazy military occupation that begins there. And so it's this American entanglement in Asia and the domination of the Pacific that, requires the demand for America to build the Great White Fleet. And then after the Great White Fleet, to build the best Air Force. An Air Force, by the way, whose effort, like the mythology of that Air Force is and how it was built is really staggering. It was highly controversial that America stacked all its chips in that way. Not just for tactical reasons ultimately, but because the people and the personalities that were pushing it were ultimately doing so, pushing against the grain of the entire military. I mean, there was a fanatic zeal to the growth of the American bomb power.
Yeah, and I think a particularly ideological one. If anybody actually is interested, I just published a piece called The Progressive Origins of Project Rand that gets into this. And this is, I think, leads us to our next point, because one of the things that's unique about the Kennedy administration is that he really creates the national security state as we know it today. It's only with Kennedy that all the guys from the Rand Corporation are actually invited into the government. And one of the reasons that we actually did do that type of aerial escalation in Vietnam is because you have eggheads, people like Walt Rostow, for example, arguing in favor of this graduated deterrence that could be rationally pursued. Dick Nixon in no world invites any of those people into the administration. There are no eggheads in the Dick Nixon administration. So that is also really interesting to me. He's not inviting people like Charles Hitch or Elaine Enthoven or my friend Hans Speyer into the administration.
You know why? It's not just that he distrusts them and he thinks they're commies and Jews or whatever. It's because he's smarter than all of them. Here's the thing that we got to remember. Nixon is vastly more intelligent than John F. Kennedy is. He's vastly more knowledgeable about the way the world works. He is a smarter guy, which means that he doesn't really need these motherfuckers buzzing in his ear. Like, he doesn't feel that insecurity that he has to shore up. And he is the smartest guy in the room most of the time.
he has then also an advantage of knowing, and this is a really good point in terms of, what makes him so intelligent by that point, is that like he's seen quite a bit, and so he has seen the limits of air power as somebody who is one of its enthusiastic boosters, right? Like this is one of the, like a paradox that sometimes comes into play where often people who have been, somebody like Nixon, who is, who is no stranger to annihilationist rhetoric when it comes to the communists. He's also able to, let's say when he is, to bring up the example you used earlier, Danny, of like, say, when Curtis LeMay is on the phone saying, like, Mr. President, we've got to drop 30 bombs in, Grenada or whatever he's decided that day. Nixon actually does have, he's like, I've seen this movie before. I know what happens when we scorch the earth and we don't, it doesn't, we like he can because he's intelligent there. What it means is that he's able to, like, when, at least as I see him, Nixon is able to come up with way more legitimate rationalizations to do the more sensible thing that he would be otherwise expected to do because of that vast experience. So when presented with the situation to, again, start nuclear conflict, like, something that not even Trump, being advised by John Bolton, managed to pull off. Like, obviously many decades of anti-nuclear dogma later, but still, Nixon, I think, is ultimately constrained by, the kinds of forces that people would, I think, used to, would chalk up to, like, history or the position of the great man or whatever, but are ultimately just like the way myriad complex factors that just, amount to deterrence, or that, are forcing history to conform to, the trajectory that we ended up seeing it take, let's say, like in Vietnam, where you have, 2 decades of mass employment in aircraft engineering and manufacturing, and, those bombs are collecting a lot of dust, man. And that's, becomes a factor that ultimately, Nixon would have to confront, just like Kennedy, and vice versa. At least as it regards to Vietnam.
So then what do you think the national security state looks under Nixon in the 1960s? Because from my read of the history, it is a thing that really does get going with Truman, the National Security Act. We all know that. And it does exist in the 1950s, and it is influential in certain degrees. But it really only becomes the behemoth, or really only starts becoming the behemoth that it does become in the 1960s with the entrance of all of these guys into the Kennedy administration, and then they get even more power under LBJ, particularly during Vietnam. What happens if there's no Robert McNamara in office? What happens if there's no systems analysis that comes to define the American war effort in Vietnam? What does the national security state look like under a Dick Nixon?
The first thing to say is, like, different people get military contracts, and that's a really important, one of the big scandal of the military at that high level during when Kennedy got popped was not actually like the missile crisis and his rift with them over that. It was actually about the fighter plane TFX, one of my favorite incidents to look at. And basically, I.F. Stone wrote a marvelous article for the New York Review of Books in the 1960s where he basically says, like, McNamara intervened on behalf of General Dynamics' bid, and General Dynamics was the big industrial patron of Lyndon Johnson, among many other things. And one of the things that, I think that episode especially illustrates the sort of rank favoritism when General Dynamics gets the bid over Boeing, illustrates the, sort of kind of all the different, like, rivalries that don't conform to politics or ideological politics, but are really just the kind of, like, quite frankly, Third Reich gangster war industrialism that is, sort of, I guess, fairly endemic to how these industries tend to operate. So I think in the case of the CIA, the instinct would have been, what could they have done more operationally in the ways of Guatemala and Cuba? Where could they have, tried to operate with a heavier hand? I'm not sure. I think Asia would have ultimately, Nixon was always so fascinated by China and was always so fascinated by East Asia that, even if it hadn't been Vietnam, it wouldn't have surprised me if he had begun to say, like, the way that we're going to, be a pincer, God damn it, we're going to get him in Berlin and we're going to get him in Asia. And like you can see him, coming up with some kind of strategy like that actually would have basically just been recreating the Atchison, what's that fucking thing? A crescent?
Yeah. like
The Great
the
Crescent?
alliance against.
Yeah. So like it would have just been like Nixon would have just found another great. I mean, he basically just would have rebuilt containment. I think, it would have been like like basically would have gotten to containment rollback. That's actually how I kind of see it. I think that he would have restored the CIA with a vaster bureaucracy. It would have grown along a similar trajectory or whatever as you were describing, Danny. It would have come into its own, but with a far broader operation, a far more intense operational mandate.
A very different character. I mean, you wouldn't have Kissinger. Kissinger is made possible by the move from the think tanks to the Kennedy and LBJ administrations. I think you have a very different U.S. foreign policy looks very different because I do think that there's agency there. And if you have, I mean, who would staff Nixon's NSC? Where would he be getting? I guess they would probably be Eisenhower administration people. So the classic lawyers, businessmen, etc.
I mean, he probably he probably would have. Robert McNamara could have very easily been the Secretary of Defense in his administration.
I mean, he picked Henry Cabot Lodge as his VP to the bafflement of a lot of Republicans who felt that he did not bring anything to the ticket, but it represented Nixon's compulsive need to keep the sleeping dogs of Wall Street and Harvard lie by throwing him a bone in the form of putting this fucking blue blood Ivy League motherfucker on the ticket.
Yankee like Nixon was always very conscious of like the Yankee power base. He really never, I think it's again like one of these, it's part of why I think like the Watergate mania, in terms of like obsessing over the what I would just describe as like the imitation salaciousness that people treat it with at the moment. Like to me, a lot of these like Nixon's tensions with the Eastern establishment, with other his power block versus other power block, industrial competition, financial competition, which becomes much more serious in the 1970s, and if anything, actually comes after like Nixon and a lot of his cronies, kind of the SNLs who had backed him, for example, become some of the huge backers of Reagan in the late 70s and into the early 1980s. So, to me, there is a very, I guess, I mean, and then there are these figures, by the way, who kind of represent a convergence, right? Like John Connolly, who is, I think, like a really great example of how you can see a lot of the forces that were sort of, advancing with history then, the ascendance of the Texas oil companies and so on. I mean, that's a force that finds its way into the White House no matter who's in charge, it would seem.
Well, what just occurred to me is that maybe Nixon brings in people from a little organization found in Appleton, Wisconsin in December 1958, the John Birch Society. So what's one of the major things that happens in the 1970s, of course, is you get the creation of the modern Republican Party and its famous three legs. What happens to the Birchers and the evangelicals if Nixon is in power a decade earlier than he is? That, to me, is a very interesting question.
So this is actually, wait, hold up one second. I had this awesome book called The Yahoos that's about the Birch Society from that time. So, like, the Birchers are, like, it's important to understand also that, like, the Birchers are, if anything, like, the Nixon mob in, like, the Birch Society. Like, those people, they have a lot of history because they're basically, all part of the people who were allied with Chiang Kai-shek back when his cause in trying to retake China was, like, the dominant, right-wing foreign policy cause celebre. Like, if you go to the like as a shorthand, way of illustrating it, if you go to the website of the Truman Library, they have a whole section of records that's just about the China lobby, and it sticks out. And Nixon and the John Birch Society, a lot of the people who co-founded, funded the John Birch Society were China lobby figures. They were really, really involved, had many business interests wrapped up with Chiang Kai-shek, were involved in, running a lot of West Coast businesses that had import-exporting businesses, shipping businesses wrapped up in China, had a lot at stake there. So I think that those people would have probably been, to the extent that they still would have had political utility in enforcing, whatever the hegemony you need right-wing paramilitary thugs for, then, they would have been given a free hand. But the problem, again, the countervailing force there is, well, you would be empowering them at the same time that, some freedom rides are going down in Selma, Alabama. And again, it's like, all right, would Richard Nixon empower the members of his coalition who would be, like, ramping up lynchings in the South. And that is a fucking, like, I am not sure Richard Nixon ends up going along with that. I think that, like, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI happily cracked down on that stuff when it finally became, like, absolutely politically convenient and necessary for them to do so. I
And he
imagine they would
needs
do the
them
same thing
less.
for Nixon.
In the early 60s, he needs them a lot less than he would in the 1970s with the reaction to the
Absolutely.
reaction to the new left. But what do you guys think about evangelicals? Or Matt, do you have any thoughts on that fellow Wisconsin society?
I mean, the question is what I think a lot of it boils down to: how does Nixon respond to civil rights? Because this is, as we said, the dominant domestic issue. And reactionaries and evangelicals they find their footing in the battle over civil rights and integration of the South. And if Nixon does not decide to do a brilliant end run and return the African American voter to his Republican bosom, and we say no, he doubles down on the right wing drift sort of the Republican Party that's already incipient. It grabs the Taft tail, the people who were coalescing around Goldwater at the time, and doubles down on them. Then you see a refusal at the federal level to do anything about civil rights, which I think leads to an acceleration of the violent phase of the civil rights movement. In our world, the Watts riot is sort of a precursor to the whole explosion of contradictions that happens in the late 60s. In 1965, you could easily see a situation where that timeline accelerates and you see 68 style riots in the early 60s in what would have been Kennedy's
and let's
first term.
Let's not forget, like, there was already, like, a fair amount of, like, social violence on that scale that, like, people are, like, is just sort of conventionally not really recalled, like, whether it's in Newark or in also rural America as well. I mean, you have, like, as Danny was alluding to with the evangelicals, you have the beginnings of, like, rural white middle class Christian backlash. Like, Pearlstein has a bunch of good anecdotes about this in Nixon land, of communities that are not particularly religious being, extremely motivated and energized all of a sudden by, like, a curriculum that supposedly takes, removes the Bible or something. And I think that kind of, like, it's I mean, it's very interesting because, I wouldn't, like, when you just, like, knowing how things did turn out and how ultimately those contradictions were or weren't resolved, I think that it would be really, really difficult because, like, to imagine how some of these contradictions would work out in a different way than they have, simply because one of the really big forces that has, ended up, forcing the outcomes of the civil rights in the 1960s, at least in social, civil rights legislation in the way that it did then, was the increasing political polarization, that begins at that time, that sort of, outward push that doesn't really yield, has not yielded to the present, that bifurcation, because that is sort of also what drives this. And, could the Republican Party be both things? Could it manage that response? Ultimately, I think that, like, if there was that kind of mass violence breaking out before the election of 64, a Democrat would come into the office and pass major social policy and also rapidly increase funding for the police in the model that ultimately came to pass in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I'd say that, like, a Nixon who goes hard right in response to the civil rights movement sees, he runs for re-election with, like, George Wallace as his running mate, and I think would probably have gotten creamed by like Eugene McCarthy or somebody.
So, guys, let's end on this now, because the 60s, as you know, is more than a decade. The 60s is a vibe, and it's a vibe that basically gets going with JFK in a lot of ways, whether you're thinking about the Alliance for Progress and this sort of decade of development, whether you're thinking about the Peace Corps, which turns into the Teacher Corps, whether you're thinking of, the assassination of JFK really pulled the wool out from people and got the 60s going. He killed the male hat. We'd still be wearing fedoras. Like a teenage Matt Christman, we would be wearing fedoras today. But how do you think, I think this is kind of an interesting question, because do you even get the new left if there's a Nixon in there? What happens if the baby boomers' first conscious political moment is not cool JFK and Camelot and him getting assassinated in 63? What if it's Dick Nixon? How does that change the vibe of the 60s? How does that change the baby boomers' trajectory?
I think that one of the big things, like the sort of, a big shift is basically like Nixon was so contemptible, like, in a very particularly and culturally stratified way. There's this apocryphal, I say apocryphal because it's not like the context is not really fair, but like there's this apocryphal story about Pauline Kael being in a theater and being like, I don't, and writing like, I didn't know anybody in here who could have voted for Nixon when he, won re-election in 72 by the landslide that he did. And I think that that kind of, part of me, the immediate question I put to myself is then, would that kind of, red state, blue state kind of degree of like, disaffiliation from, so much of the polis that comes, with Nixon, is at least, even if it's just in vibe, that is really the, and is itself more than anything kind of a reflection of the culmination of the 60s rather than any, whole impulse by itself. I don't know. I think that like, Nixon may ultimately have been defeated by a John Kennedy who is 4 years older. And if anything, his health issues had gotten a bit better and he wasn't totally doped up all the time. And, maybe he found God and wasn't sleeping around or something. And then baby boomers are even more brain rotted because they got a cool president who lived.
Matt, any takes on the Nixon 60s? What's the vibe of the Nixon 60s?
Well, I think you see some sort of open race war in America, like at a lower. I mean, obviously we had that. We had that for 20 years. I mean, we had it basically since the end of the Civil War. It just gained. It went up and down in time, in intensity. You'd have spikes, like a big spike at the end of Reconstruction with the Redeemers,
and we measure it. We measure it with our e-meters. Value.
A big spike in the post World War I era, the Red Summer, 1917 or 1919. And then, of course, a big spike after World War II. And I think it just would have been a more intense and earlier a creation, which makes me think, does that accelerate the creation of this like newly enlightened, middle class who end up being the social auxiliaries of the civil rights movement? Or do they sort of retreat into racial awareness? And does that sort of that process of cosmopolitanization that occurs when you wire up a country with a media network that connects them all to each other instantaneously, maybe that gets interrupted, broken up before it can really have an effect. I mean, it's I don't know, and or there's a question because America has always been this one way or another tenuously assembled structure that really depends on a lot more than other countries on people all sort of collectively agreeing to lie to each other because of our constitutional system, which means if there's greater stress placed on it earlier, do we see instead of, this culture war, a return to sectional civil war?
Well, I think that one of the big, like, and this is sort of like, it's a great example of like, like the weird push and pull of history, right? Because what you were correctly describing as the moment of like this incredible schism, what is Eisenhower doing? He's laying down the interstates. He is building the physical infrastructure to connect the nation as never before. By the way, opting for cars over rail and all that, but like still, moreover, there is a logic of national development that is, I think, like, part of, you could even argue is part of what ultimately, it's those decisions made in the 50s to commit America to confront the Cold War and communist threat as one nation, as one unified nation, that ultimately makes it so that by the 1960s, the federal government, whether, Richard Nixon would want it or not, is on a fucking collision course with the South. Is like on the race question, as it were, breaks out into the open again. And, does Richard Nixon accidentally help stoke a race war, or does he bottle it? And that is a true, like, that's a true flip a coin, sir, to me.
In order to bottle it, Nixon would have to carry out like a continuation of Eisenhower's domestic spending agenda, which was coming into direct conflict with its military spending, a reckoning that ended up coming in the 70s, and that would have been there the whole time. And the question is, does capital essentially allow Nixon to fulfill that? Or is the threat it poses, like there was an option in the 1970s during the stagflation era to fix the problem by dumping money on the lowest quadrant of Americans, just hugely increasing their spending capacity to soak up this inflation. That could have been done, but that would have been literally empowering with a direct redistribution of fucking resources and capital, the most dispossessed and therefore most racially coded American.
Well, but this is why, but this is Nixon. But brother, Nixon did introduce the solution to this in his presidency. What would become the tried and true method, also re-employed with the 1986 National Security Declaration of Ronald Reagan, which is that there is a war on drugs, and that there, in addition to being a war on drugs that has to rapidly increase the number of people that we, prosecute, we also have to lock them up, which becomes, by the way, a marvelous regional employment program all across America. And so that to me is, one of the things then, we also then, would Nixon have to turn to the carceral solution to the problems you lay out, of the fact that if you're going to have this redistribution effect, you can do it you can either actually reckon with it and, empower the proletariat that would kill you, or you can lock them up and, actually find ways to take the directionally, most disadvantaged by, the laissez-faire system, people who live in, rural, Colorado, and poof, in the 1990s, ADX Florence pops up there, and then they have a jail. Or you do it in 1960, what succeeds Alcatraz? It's, Alcatraz moves from being a prison where the Supermax facility where they lock up people, next to San Francisco, whatever. It's relocated when it's closed to Marion, Illinois, in the middle of nowhere. So there's a way in which you can literally see what Matt's talking about in terms of how they actually would resolve those directional conflicts, and did, both under Democratic administrations in the 1960s and then again in the 1970s after they had launched, the drug wars.
And you have with Carter a guy who just was not what he was driven by his conscience to do was exactly what Nixon had been specifically trying to avoid, which is neutering the American political structure, like neutering the power of the president and America as like a self-determining political entity. And that is, that's the reason some people think that he got basically stitched up on Watergate to get him out of there, because
Lobo Homo said, goodbye, Dickie. Bye-bye.
People are talking about it, folks. People are saying it more and more. But if we say, so Nixon gets a chance early to assert himself and create this new carceral welfare state, does that do anything to prevent the neoliberal turn when the inevitable 70s energy crisis kicks in?
Well, I think, though, that what we're describing is the neoliberal term come early. The difference is that, the intellectual maturation that had happened by the end of the 70s that allowed, what we call neoliberal as, an intellectual movement to sort of, develop. I think that, that scaffolding hadn't been, Hayek's reputation hadn't been adequately resuscitated yet. Milton Friedman hadn't had his big heyday. He hadn't won his Nobel yet. I think
and there's no deindustrialization yet, or at least not to the same degree.
So precisely.
And this actually leads me to an interesting hinge point. Maybe we should gather the three of us next season, which is Nixon is president in the early 60s. Then JFK does 2 terms, and then Nixon comes back. And what does that look like?
Yes.
Nixon in the early 70s. Noah Kulwin of the Blowback podcast, thank you so much for joining Matt and myself. We really appreciate it and look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to coming back.
You don't have Kulwin to kick around anymore.
You won't have Kulwin to kick around anymore.
All right, guys. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Later.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final Hinge Points of the second season. I'm Danny Bessner, normally of the American Prestige podcast, and I am here, as always, with my friend Matt Christman. And we are excited, overjoyed, ecstatic to welcome to the podcast Meagan Day Meagan is an editor at Jacobin and the author of literally hundreds of articles. She made you socialist, and we're glad you're here for that reason. Meagan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Danny and Matt.
So today we're gonna this might be the most controversial one we did this season. This might be up there, Matt, with the SPD, doing things wrong in World War One episode from last season, or maybe the episode about the Soviet Union, which in my understanding angered some people. But today we're going to talk about what if Bernie would have won the 2020 presidential election. So Meagan or Matt, whoever wants to start, what do you think was at stake with the Bernie run in 2020, and how did it differ from 2016? And whichever one of you want to take it, just go for it. Follow your hearts.
I think essentially what was at stake was whether or not we were going to persist in a kind of neoliberal malaise where it seems impossible to transform our society. It seems like the engine has been turned on and the motor is running and no one's driving and there's no intervention possible, right? Or whether or not politics can actually be used to transform the nature of society to improve people's lives. That was what was at stake in 2020. Now, it's not like over, right? Clearly, I still believe that politics can be used to transform people's lives, and I plan on, continuing to try to put my energies into that project. But you have to be honest, like, Bernie lost 2020, and we lost that vision for the foreseeable future. We're basically going to be seeing more of the same. Some things can get a little bit better. Biden sometimes does some good stuff, and we're glad he does that instead of the other stuff. But overall, the overall situation doesn't change much, and politics recedes into the background for most people because they correctly identify that there's not very much that they can do through politics to actually change the material conditions of their lives.
I mean, yeah, what we're seeing is a turn among those people who are turned on to politics to be oriented towards politics specifically because of the only remaining promise government can make, which is to inflict some sort of misery on someone that you don't like, some group that is composed of your political enemies, it's cultural enemies, which basically, the same thing at this point. And so that's it. The notion of government as a force for positive good in people's lives, yeah, we kind of we lost a chance to see that that theory of governments attempt to take control of these cascading crises, all of which just started to ramp up at about the exact same time that the Bernie campaign collapsed, which is, I think, why at the end of the day, it is an interesting thing to wonder, like, how would an isolated Sanders presidency have handled this specific confluence of crisis that we're certainly in the middle of? But it also is, in my mind, not terribly likely to have ever happened, at least now in retrospect, we can say, precisely because there just was not enough ambient faith remaining, certainly after Obama and what happened in the decade after his presidency, to kindle into widespread commitment to believing again, or to believing the specific things that Bernie was saying. Instead, even though his campaign was incredibly focused on trying to pitch a government solution to the problems of life in America, the people whose lives have been getting worse most precipitously have lost faith that any government can actually do those things for them.
So before we actually get into the hinge point, I think it might actually be interesting for listeners to talk about, how do you guys see people having responded? Now, it's a couple of years. What do you see as the tendencies of this post-Bernie moment? Because in some sense, we're saying these tendencies wouldn't have happened, or maybe we said they would have happened. But let's set the scene before we get into the actual hinge point. Megan's raising her hand. So Meagan, why don't you start?
Yeah, I just wanted to give like a broad outline of what I see happening. So prior to 2015, when Bernie Sanders first announced his first run for the presidency and things really started to change politically, the mood started to change politically in response to that, I would say that the national political mood was characterized by a combination of depoliticization and demoralization. So those are two slightly different things. By that, what I mean is, like, demoralization is what we just talked about. People don't believe, they don't believe anything is possible through politics. Depoliticization is sort of a consequence of that, which is that they don't really care. They don't pay attention to politics. They find it boring. It's like they think of it as a hobby that other people have. It's not really their thing, right? So for, I guess you could say that with the beginning of the ascent of neoliberalism in the 1970s, there started to be a kind of serious campaign to imaginatively foreclose on alternatives for people. I mean, you saw this most clearly with Margaret Thatcher basically just straight up saying there is no alternative, right? In fact, that was in the context of a speech where she was essentially like, I know people don't like that I'm imposing austerity, but I also know that you can't do anything about it because we've won. That's to paraphrase, but that's the basic idea, was that, you can't really, you're demoralized because nothing can change, and you're depoliticized because there's no point in paying attention to politics if nothing can change. 2015 changed that, and not just because of Bernie Sanders, but also because of Donald Trump. So suddenly in 2015, and especially 2016, which is the year everything really, really sort of broke apart, the neoliberal center seemed to not be holding. And it seemed everybody across the spectrum started to see new political possibilities in either direction, whether those possibilities seemed very frightening to them or very exciting to them. Either way, it seemed like there was some slippage happening, and the future was as yet unwritten. Whereas before it had seemed very much locked into place. So during 2015 to 2020, which I think we should refer to as like the Bernie/Trump era, you started to see more politicization and more encouragement, which I guess is the opposite of demoralization, more of a sense that things might be possible to transform society in one way or another. And I better pay attention to politics because those possibilities are both really exciting and also really terrifying right now. So between 2015-ish, 2016 definitely, and 2020, the demoralization and the depoliticization both started to reduce. Now, 2020 has come and gone, and we're in the post-2020 era, and I don't think that we reverted back to the original combination of demoralization and depoliticization. Instead, what I think has happened is that people are demoralized, like they were before. They don't think anything can change, but they got politicized between 2015 and 2020. And once you're politicized, it's really kind of hard to turn that off. And so people are more politically literate. They're paying attention to politics. Their identities are wrapped up in politics. Their social worlds are more structured around politics. They feel angrier at people who disagree with them politically. There's a hyper politicization and hyper political polarization, but without the belief that anything can change. Yeah. And this is like actually a really messed up combination if you think about it. People don't think that politics can actually transform anyone's lives. They don't believe that change is possible, but they are highly invested in politics and in their own identity as political creatures. So you have people sort of at each other's throats. People hate each other, but they don't think anything can change, is really what I'm saying.
That's why they're able to still be political, because they do think that things can change for the worse. And they think that the government can decide some people it's going to be worse for than others. And so even though things will be worse, it will be the downward trajectory. Within the moment, there will still be relative positions, and the relative positions can be and will be determined politically. And so that is the fuel for investing in a political identity, is picking somebody to go into the bone thresher first before you. Yeah, that's right. And that's what I was going to say too, is that this unfortunate combination of demoralization and hyper-politicization is really a breeding ground for reaction. Reaction in it takes on different faces, in my opinion. There's the obvious ones and the more subtle ones. But in any case, reactionary ideas, including just seething, blood-curdling hatred for your fellow man, and born out of sort of alienation and demoralization, plus hyper-politicization, is what we're going to see more and more of. So I'm unfortunately of the belief that we're sliding into a reactionary period, partly as a result of the politicization that a much better period, well, not better in some sense. I mean, Trump was president. That wasn't so great. But Bernie was around, and that contributed to the major politicization as well.
A more hopeful period, at least. And I think that's interesting because I do think, my whole theory is that we actually don't live in an era of mass politics. So I think you're going to see a lot of this political energy be channeled in very strange directions because it's very difficult to organize. Labor relations have been so reconfigured. The administrative state, which really started getting going during World War II, is now basically unassailable. You basically can't really take it over. Even if there was a coup, I don't see how someone would actually be able to exercise this power through the state. It's not the 1930s when the state is just literally much simpler. and you could get your hands around it. You can't really even get your hands around the state. So we're in this real moment where there is a lot of political energy, and that energy will be necessarily channeled in cultural directions. So building off of that, before we even get into the hinge point, what do you guys think are the formations that you see and you were recording this in September 2022? What do you think the formations that you see coming into being?
Well, I think there's a lot of variety at the grassroots. People think that they're part of currents within broader cultural and political movements, but all of them tail the two major parties, because the Democrat and the Republican parties are the only political actors. And because all we are doing to reinforce our political identity is consume political media for the most part, then we are always our framing of every issue, our framing of every phenomenon as it emerges from the slow motion collapse of capitalism is filtered through the actions of those people who are able to determine the news of the day. And that is the political class, who are fully invested in one of the two major parties, because that's where the money is. There's going to be no other formation, because there is no other material basis for one. So there are people who are still tailing the Democratic Party from the left, thinking that they're going to corral it into a socialist direction. But we've seen the party, even though it cannot defend itself from perhaps the ending of formal democracy on the medium term, but it can absolutely defend its narrow, specific, particular parochial interests against being overthrown from within. Because again, there's no material basis outside of individual donors and the remnants of the labor movement, and even not most of them, because most of the formal structures of the labor movement are still totally subsumed within the Democratic Party. One way or another, they are going to determine, and then people can sift through the rubble and the refuse and build some sort of narrative about what's happening, but they're not going to be able to impose themselves on the moment. The same thing, there are now people who have convinced themselves that they can tail the Republicans from some sort of national populist conservatism. They can backdoor socialism, basically, by disarming culture war. But they are in the same material position related to the Republican Party that the left is to the Democrats. It is an unassailable readout. So that means we will only have the politics that the parties decide we can have. Even though we're going to be seeing, escalating crises, economic and ecological, and people's lives made worse in specific ways, the way we address them are going to be determined by the parties, filtered through the media, which means they will definitionally revolve around identifying a scapegoat and then seeking their destruction. Finding some political coalition that will make that happen. And then people with that, people are going to be materially contributing to that, but the only way most of us do materially contribute to politics, by voting in their individual way, uncoordinated, outside of, their self-conception as part of a trance of political identity. But no matter what's in their head, what's going to be the actual material result of that is they're going to vote in a party full of people who can only answer to the material base that underlines that party. So yeah, it can only escalate. The problem, though, and this is really where there is opportunity, is that the system as it exists cannot sustain that, because the constitutional order that we have, what's made it such a miracle of the Western world and made us such a incredibly resilient structure compared to other democracies that have emerged in the years since, is that so much of it rests on agreed upon, essentially gentlemanly rules of political action that can only sustain in a context where everyone sort of understands that politics it's not life or death because of our material prosperity and the sort of unending horizon of material prosperity that allows us to disarm and to not go as hard to the paint as we could. The thing that makes us let up our blows with one another and allows us to blow off steam. I mean, even that, we say it's resilient. There was still a civil war that killed fucking 600,000 people with that system. That is how little it can sustain people deciding to just not pretend that this stuff that is fake is real. Not pretend that that the floor is lava. And so it can't sustain politics where one half, and eventually the other one, because they're going to wise up eventually, they have to, breaks the compact. So, that's why you can't just assume that nothing can change, or even for the positive. But I think we increasingly have to come around to the idea that those opportunities are going to be found in crisis. They're not going to be something that can be built within the current structure. It needs to be movement building towards the specific end, the teleology of confrontation with a state in crisis, rather than towards getting short-term reformist goals. And like that, it has its own contradictions, but I think it's the only way to like clearly look at the current situation that we're in.
Meagan, do you have any sense about the formations that you see in your day-to-day life as a socialist warrior?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Matt said. Difficult as it is to admit, because it's like, it's pretty depressing to think about how stuck we are in many ways. But I will say that, this is also depressing. One of the things that I notice that I want to tack on to Matt's comments is like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party being stand-ins for different, dominant hegemonic cultures, as we know. They actually share a lot of DNA, but they tend to elide that, and in fact go out of their way to exaggerate their differences so as to rile up their base and get buy-in, political identity buy-in, which could pay off in elections. But the way that it actually pans out in real time is like pretty interesting to watch. It's like you have two divorced parents who are like dealing with custody over, the children, and they like refuse to see each other, but there are moments of handoff. So by that, what I mean is like, think about early COVID, like the very first signs of COVID, when we first understood that there was a pandemic, but it hadn't quite hit American soil yet, for reasons that made sense at the time. It seemed like it was shaping up that was going to be a Republican issue, that Republicans were going to be the ones who were saying the pandemic is real, COVID is coming, it's very scary. And there's no reason why that shouldn't have necessarily been the case. It's just that because Trump was president, when the crisis started in the United States, and for a variety of other sort of minor reasons, the positions switched. And so the Democrats then became the ones who were saying you have to take COVID more seriously. And the Republicans started to become the ones who started to say, you're blowing it out of proportion and you're messing everything up with these heavy-handed responses and so on. But it wasn't preordained that way. The only thing that was guaranteed was that these two forces were not going to agree. These two forces were actually going to take the issue and polarize it as much as possible and drag as many people down rabbit holes of craziness and animus with them. That was the only thing that was guaranteed. The actual positions themselves were not guaranteed, though they were definitely influenced by real factors on the ground. So I feel like we're seeing more and more of this like endlessly recursive self-identification in opposition to the imagined behemoth other. Behemoth. My wife always says it's pronounced behemoth. Well, how is that word pronounced?
I've always been partial to behemoth, but the nerds at Webster's claim that it's behemoth.
All right, so you see my point, which is that like it's crazy making, because you're basically taking people and telling them, if you want to have a consistent political identity, which because of increasing politicization means a consistent, coherent self-identity, period, which is a psychological need of all people, then you need to buy in as hard as possible to, our group take on said issue, at the expense of all nuance and at the expense of all relationships that you might have with people sort of who might differ from you. And it's just, the problem is that it doesn't actually it isn't on to reality in the world. You're asking people to basically behave irrationally in order to shore up a coherent identity, psychologically speaking. So basically everyone's going crazy, and it's going to probably go a little bit more crazy than this.
Well, let me propose a different world. Let's go back to early 2020.
We gotta go back!
And a beautiful man named Bernard Sanders wins the Democratic Party nomination, destroys Trump in the election, and becomes president. Let's start with the best case scenario. What do you think happens, and how are things different if Bernie enters in January 2021? We're still in the throes of COVID. I don't think the vaccine had even been released yet. What happens then?
Yeah, it was being first tentative rolls out by that point.
Yes. So what is the best case scenario? What does Bernie do?
Okay, I hadn't really necessarily prepared to answer this question in a world where the COVID-19 pandemic happens. But of course, I mean, I should have thought about it a little bit more because, like, it was coming either way, right?
Yeah, it's already there.
This is like such a good question though, because there's only really so much that the president, especially an incoming administration, can do with the COVID crisis. I don't know 100% about the public health stuff, but I will say economically, you would have seen a big fat checks a lot sooner and with a lot more frequency, to make sure that people are not getting, weren't getting their head held underwater by the pandemic economy. That would have just been a no-brainer to Bernie Sanders, and it's something that could be done and was done by executive order, if I'm correct. So yeah, no question, big fat checks all the time.
So we know the presidency is very constrained on domestic policy, and that it would be very difficult to imagine a Democratic Congress, even one that has better margins than the one that currently exists, which I think would have probably happened because you saw this big ticket splitting among affluent white suburbanites, where they were voting Biden in the presidency and then voting for Republican senators and congresspeople, which ended up dampening the coattail effects, even though Biden won relatively comfortably nationwide, and did incredibly well in these areas. But these are guys who, at the end of the day, they still support the Republican agenda. They want low taxes, and they would have probably voted for Trump against Bernie. But there would have been probably a huge swing among working class voters, and specifically the working class Latinos who voted for Trump in the end, or who voted more for Trump than they had for previous Republicans. I think Bernie would likely dominate that area, and would have maybe canceled out that effect and led to a bigger Democratic majority. But even there, the center of gravity of the parties in Congress is going to be dominated by the machine itself, which is inveterately and endlessly hostile to Bernie, would not cooperate with any of his broad projects. You might see some checks, but they also might decide to close the purse strings on him. So what could he do realistically with executive orders to try to enact some sort of agenda independent of Congress?
I mean, theoretically, you could do quite a bit. I mean, if you look at someone like FDR, who over his term did over 3,000, I think you could actually do quite a bit, because even if the executive orders are eventually ruled unconstitutional, I mean, you still have to fight them. It's basically a way to divide your enemy and conquer your enemy. Just issue 1,000 executive orders in the first 3 months, and the enemy is going to have to deal with that. That you're going to have to pick and choose. The problem with someone like Biden is that an institutionalist like that would never do that. So the irony there, I think, and this is, I think, a broader problem, I'd like to hear what Meagan thinks about it. I think the only way we would realistically get even minor forms of social democracy in the American state would be through profoundly anti-democratic means, which is frankly what an executive order is. That is about as undemocratic an act as one could get in the formal system of government. But I think it would have been absolutely necessary for Bernie to sort of pursue those moves. So there's an inherent tension, I think, at the very beginning of a Sanders administration between the necessity of the executive order and the fact that that is sure to stoke resentment, sure to shore up a presidency that one doesn't necessarily want shoring up over the long term. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I wrote an article, the winter 2019 edition of Jacobin. I wrote an article called Wielding the Imperial Presidency, which was basically a roundup of executive order ideas for Bernie Sanders. And I'm at this point, I both like pine, but also cringe a little bit to recall that when I was writing this, I was thinking to myself, or especially like there were a couple of sweet months, or maybe 1 month, where we thought it was possible that he was going to win. I was like, well, he's going to really need my article, because that's going to be really useful for him when he goes about deciding which executive orders to implement. So there's actually a lot that he could do with executive orders. And yes, you're right, Danny. There is a kind of contradiction there, because the whole purpose of the political project that Sanders represents is to increase democracy, broadly speaking, extended into the economy, for example, but also actually fulfill its promise in the political realm as well. And in order to do that, because of the constraints on the presidency, he would have to basically act alone be like a sort of one-man instigator of a kind of bubbling up of true democracy, right? But he would be obligated to use any tool at his disposal. Like if we the people had put him in power, he would be obligated to use any tool at his disposal to further the agenda that the people had voted on by voting for him. And that would include executive orders. And there's actually a ton that he could do via executive order. We tend to forget that because, like you said, it's just not the norm. We have so many institutionists, who become presidents, and people just aren't really that interested. Trump actually did go kind of nuts with some executive orders for a minute, and it worked. And when I say that it worked, I mean you can actually affect both real change via executive order, even though it's temporary. The courts can strike it down, the next president can reverse it, so it's very tenuous. But you can affect real change right now, and then once people actually get a taste of that, sometimes it just becomes much harder politically to push back against it. You can create new constituencies for new ideas that didn't exist mere moments ago. And now,
for example, a national intelligence agency. The OSS was created by a lot of those wartime agencies were created by executive orders.
Exactly.
So it's a way to reshape the state in a very serious way.
Yeah, you can create agencies, which is very good. You can create task forces, which usually just means nothing, but you can actually create real task forces that set about, laying the groundwork for developing, new stuff. What were you going to say, Matt?
I was going to say all of those actions would have profound blowback, though. Like there would be a coordinated media and political resistance to that on all of the traditional grounds of big government overreach and using the same cultural language. Now, Bernie might be able to diffuse at the margins that appeal with his class politics, but you still have very durable political coalitions. And you would also have the fact that the Democratic Party itself would not have his back in these issues, would be doing the thing where they would ritually be disavowing him, that would be a significant challenge. And it would...
Well, Matt, could you expand on that? How do you think the party would have responded? That's very interesting to me.
I think the party would have gotten behind him formally. And you're going to have Schumer and Pelosi, those guys like, we're going to work with the president to get the agenda for Americans. But as soon as the White House did anything, they would obstruct it, leak about the administration like a fucking shiv in a way probably never seen before, make it so that there would be basically nothing that they could do without it being front page news, because it would be impossible to engage with either legislative branch in any business confidentially, because it would be just an enemy force. I think and then you'd have this dual face of a party that would not totally sell him out to the craze, like the insane right-wing reaction, which would be significant, but it would absolutely hold him at arm's length. And if it was a successful cultural conflagration, if they were successful in really taking advantage of the fact that Sanders' presidency is not the expression of some socialist majority, but it's like this forlorn hope attempt to kindle the creation of one, which means you're not going to have some durable social base that can stand up and defend him. I remember multiple people, when Bernie was riding high and we had all convinced ourselves he was going to win, at least I knew I had, I saw a number of people saying they couldn't wait for Bernie to win so that they could go out and protest him for his insufficiently radical stance on whatever issue they cared about. And that was just a profound misunderstanding of the stakes and of what was happening. The whole gift of the Bernie presidency is that for the first time, I was talking about how we're all downstream of political actors. This is the first time that you could have another actor on the stage to disrupt and break up a ritualized fantasy make-up fight between two equally capitalist parties. You would have another pole of action. And that means that I'm a pessimist probably by nature when it comes to politics. I would, even when Bernie was riding high and I convinced myself that he was going to win, I still, in my mind, steeled myself as this is going to be probably a forlorn, vain fight. The people are not going to get Medicare for all. There's not going to be any real substantial change, the stuff people want. But my God, especially looking at the last 2 years and how awful everything has gotten and how there's no answer for any of it at any level of political action. I just think, imagine that the context of this sort of crisis and this sort of political intensity and political cultural valence with a political actor who every day would essentially issue, some sort of orders for the people on the team. Hey, if you want to hold on to that political identity that is now part of your cultural costume and part of your social life and all this stuff, you have to do something other than consume media and vote every 2 to 4 years. Like, we're going to define political subjectivity differently. And of course, a lot of people would be like, I didn't sign up for that. No, thank you. I'm going to actually decide that Bernie's a sellout and CIA agent, and that it's time to go back to just paralysis and empty critique. But I think that the liveness of the action would eventually draw in the majority of people with any sort of good intention. Like, anybody who's not fully cynically trying to get the most out of socialism as a cultural costume as they can, that's a number of people. But there's such a force multiplier in having people acting together that it disrupts the entire house of cards, and maybe they still fall, but they fall differently.
It would have been incumbent on Bernie to take advantage of the pushback from the Democratic Party, from the bipartisan political establishment, certainly from the capitalist class, all the blowback that he got, which is inevitable, as both of you pointed out. It can be an opportunity. I mean, it's not guaranteed that you're going to be able to surmount this opportunity with any strategy, right? But basically, it would have been like, the Salvador Allende strategy, which is to basically point at it and see, this is how much they hate you. Like, tell the people, this is how much they hate you. This is how much they don't want you to have what I just signed an executive order allowing you to have. And in that way, the use of executive orders in particular can set the parameters of the political conversation. And ideally, sort of hopefully along the lines that Matt was talking about, change the way that people think about themselves politically as a defender of something that the president, Bernie Sanders, who they voted for, wants to actually give them to make their lives better, but is being obstructed by the power structure. And so they have to get out on the streets, and they have to organize, and they have to protest, and they have to actually fight to win this thing. And yeah, it sounds like a little bit of a impossibility. It sounds like a nice, pipe dream, until you realize that we're thinking about it from 2022, when everything seems really,
Yes.
really
when the government gave up. When everybody was left to fend for themselves.
Right. But the truth is that between 2016 and 2020, we saw mass uprisings of people in the streets. The last one was the George Floyd uprisings. And in some ways, I think a lot of people thought it was going to be a beginning, but it was really kind of like a death knell. But think about the way that people got into the streets at the beginning of the Trump administration. Remember those airport protests? Remember the Women's March? I mean, it's not impossible to imagine that if Bernie Sanders had been president, that level of political engagement would have stayed high like that. And people who are now currently sitting at home doing nothing political could have then found themselves in a position to actually get themselves out into the streets to defend the kinds of things, the kinds of gains that Bernie Sanders, the person they elected, the person they put in office, was trying to muscle through to make lives better for themselves and their family and their community.
And the thing that would help him in that is, yes, we say, a huge blowback that is supported by both parties behind the scenes, the Republicans publicly, and is bipartisanly embraced by all the sections of the mainstream media. But we are living in a world where part of the crisis of our democracy is that those institutions have been completely and totally delegitimized in people's eyes, which means because a lot of people voted for Trump, the media freaked out about him, and because they had not gone through the same cultural conditioning as the people who made the media and the people who consume the majority of it, or were alienated by that cultural costume, they saw Trump and they did not see who the media claimed to be there, and they're full of shit, and now they have basically decided that a media consensus around a reality is a counter indicator of its truth, which is honestly a better heuristic than the opposite of assuming it's all real. But of course leaves you ungrounded, which is why people are drifting around and drifting to reaction, because that's where the only action is. There is a world where with this level of a delegitimization of institutions, when Sanders comes in and gets everybody against him in the mainstream media and the political parties, maybe those same people and a bunch of other people who were alienated by Trump's costume in the same way that the liberal media was, decide, actually, no, you guys are completely full of shit. Nothing you say is true, and fuck off. And that would have instantly created a market that the media industry would have had to have served, And so you get counter-hegemonic media institutions and a new
Like Chapo
infrastructure
Trap
for people
House.
to act. I mean, yes, like as the tip of a spear.
And Jacobin, of course, yeah.
Instead, alienation from the media, or alienation from the institutional reality that's like keeping us all on a fucking express train to hell, is now in a state where it's threatened by Trump and what Trump represents, which is the final extinguishment of these institutions. But it can only appeal to the people who are supposed to stop this from happening through institutions that, by their abuse, have been delegitimized. So they can't do it. Nothing they say about him can have the effect they want it to, because there is no consensus reality that can be represented by these institutions. Nobody can be Cronkite or Murrow and make a declaration from a unaffiliated middle that was never real, but that could be consensually fantasized.
And the Cronkite and Murrow situation is also made possible by the Cold War. Very unique situation. But one thing that is interesting to me is that you guys were talking about the creation of this counter-hegemonic impulse. But how would that work in terms of mechanisms? Because if we're still, the American state's still the American state. There's still this basically administrative state that does most of the governance outside of any popular will or popular structures. So one thing that's curious is, like, to me, is how would Bernie have reshaped labor relations? How would Bernie have instantiated an actually more democratic world in the face of a state that is basically designed not to do either of those things? We've seen the Starbucks unionizations, we've seen the Amazon unionizations, but I'm wondering how a world in which Bernie had won would have affected these much deeper structural trends.
Well, as far as the labor movement, more specifically speaking, goes, I think that Bernie Sanders has demonstrated over the course of his entire career a real willingness to go out of his way to build union consciousness, awareness of unions, enthusiasm for unions, and union identity among people who happen to be members of unions, but maybe don't really feel a strong sense of identity yet. And I would only imagine that he would do the same thing as president. I really believe that labor union membership would have spiked under Bernie Sanders' presidency, just because of the level of enthusiasm for unions generated. It would have obviously come up against bad labor law. We have bad labor law. We have major restrictions and regulations. We have right to work states. We have hostile courts and so on. But right now, one of the main problems with labor union density in the United States is that people don't really see a need for unions. They don't really have in their mind unions as a live option when they're struggling at their workplaces. It is actually possible to unionize your workplace pretty much anywhere that you work. So people aren't actually initiating union drives. Yeah, they're hard to win. Yeah, there's union busting campaigns. Yeah, the laws are written in a way that can actually tie you up or trip you up. And those things all need to be changed. But the real problem right now is that people don't even think I should start a union at my workplace. They think this job fucking sucks and I should get another job. I hope I can get another job soon. Maybe if I do a side hustle, then that'll be good for my resume, and then I can actually be eligible for a better job down the line, etc. And so I think if you had a president who was traveling across the country, stumping for the labor movement and talking about how necessary it is to join a union, you would see people wanting to initiate union drives in their workplaces more. And the labor movement, the sort of established labor movement would be the recipient and the beneficiary of that. That would also improve and increase. More members means more muscle, which means that labor has a bigger seat at the table, which means that labor can actually push through some of the changes that it wants to see on those laws and regulations. There was the PRO Act is a good example of a big piece of legislation that contains a lot of different changes that need to happen to American labor law. But unfortunately, labor itself is too weak to actually muscle through anything like the PRO Act. Nobody's listening to the labor movement. If the labor movement was bigger, then maybe people would listen. So you could see it having a dual effect. You build the labor movement in order to change the rules in order to build the labor movement. It could have actually genuinely set off a kind of snowball effect where we could see a resurgence of labor in this country. And to be honest, Bernie lost, and we're still seeing the effects of the Bernie moment on the labor movement. The labor movement's not in great shape. We shouldn't be talking about some great labor upsurge. It's not necessarily the case that that's around the corner. Union density is still idling at a very pathetic level, but there is a new mood of labor militancy, and a lot of it you have to give credit where it's due. A lot of it was inspired by, if not directly Bernie Sanders, though some organizers, like at Starbucks, for example, will tell you they're directly inspired by Bernie Sanders. But if not directly Bernie Sanders, then the mood of pro-union sentiment, the vibe, and who's responsible for the vibe? The Bernie Sanders movement. It's not, maybe it's not just the man himself, but like the Bernie Sanders movement, broadly speaking, is responsible for bringing that vibe to the American people, and it's paying dividends even though he didn't even win. He didn't even win a primary, much less a general. He's certainly not our president, and we're still seeing it paying off. So I would imagine that if Bernie Sanders had won, whatever other obstacles he would have faced, and there would have been plenty, and whatever other blowback there might be from this labor upsurge, which Capitol would definitely retaliate in response to the labor upsurge, I think you would see higher rates of unionization in the United States, just as a direct result of Bernie Sanders being president.
All right. Well, speaking of the obstacles, earlier you said that this would be sort of a Allende-style strategy. Does that mean that it would get a Allende-style response? Or does the U.S. have privilege to not have to worry about that happening if they accidentally let a mild social democrat into office?
I mean, are we gonna shift from the positive scenario to the negative scenario? Because that's like
I think we've just been intermingling. Let's talk about negative, though.
Okay, so my response to you, Matt, is there would have been some truly horrific response definitely from the capitalist class, probably from various united elements of the state. And I don't mean, the Democratic and Republican parties and their representatives in Congress. I mean, other elements of the state, the FBI, the CIA. Like, I don't think that he would have been cooed, I don't think directly, but I do think a 1-2 punch of monitoring and surveilling and possibly doing their best to dismantle pro-Sanders social movements on the ground, while also the capitalist class can disinvests from regions that are benefiting from Sanders policy in order to decrease the popularity of his agenda, because now suddenly you have joblessness and unemployment and disinvestment and so on. That combination would work to just fuck everything up. And I think we probably would have seen a concerted effort to do it. And it might have worked. I mean, it might have been the case, I'll just tell you this. The late socialist intellectual Leo Panitch, wonderful guy. I had the privilege of being on a panel with him after Bernie lost, and I was waxing poetic about the world that had just slipped through our fingers, essentially. And Leo said, he said, I always really appreciate how Meagan, speaks with the passion of an activist, but I think that she's being a little too sanguine about what would have happened if Bernie Sanders had won. And that was a good reality check, because he essentially described a situation where, yes, it's going to be better than this. Everything's better than this. This is just nothing. The world that we live in now, there's no hope for political transformation. We're stuck in a stalemate, right? But it would have been good for new possibilities to be generated, new types of political subjectivities to come into play, and the parameters of politics to change. So that's a net positive. But as for the administration itself and its fate, probably very grim, because there are very, very powerful actors that would have wanted to put the kibosh on it and would have had the means to do so. I think basically the worst case scenario is the Sanders administration is ground into a pulp and can't really achieve much of anything that it sets out to do. But even that has a silver lining, which is that people's politicization would find an outlet in understanding the degree to which they had been denied the promises by the Bernie campaign and which actors were denying them. And hopefully that would have just yielded better American political prospects in the future.
Yeah, it's a question is whether his struggle, his probably futile struggle against these deep institutions, would, as being observed by a populace, it would be observed as this, passion play of this hero being brought down, which would then orient them towards a certain politics and a certain way of understanding themselves, their institutions that they were embedded in, and what would be the right thing to do in any given situation, And then maybe you get January 6th, but a good one, the idea of having a bunch of one of the things that made January 6th deeply depressing was just thinking this is a thing that should absolutely be on the table, this sort of act. And if it isn't, we don't really have anything you could meaningfully call a democracy. If you can't storm the fucking Capitol, you don't really have a democratic polity. But my God, for this guy over this, and that's the tragedy of it. But if you, the question is, can that sort of energy
be unwound from the specific grotesque spectacle that Trump represents, the curdled middle class resentment politics, where you're really there to stick it to some imagined resented other, and even if you would prefer there to be national health care, and you don't like big business, and you like unions, all of that is subject and subordinated to your just deeper reptile desire to enact a pageant of resentment as politics. Could that energy be detached from that, or are they inextricable? Is it a package deal where we've only built that capacity within Americans? The other has been sort of slowly eroded away.
It's such a good question, Matt. I have to, just in terms of like the political libido and whether or not the politicization of the Trump/Bernie era was actually just like rising resentment, or whether there was a kernel of solidarity in there. That's such a good question. I have to think that based on what I've seen with my own eyes, that at least on the Bernie side of things, you started to see people first animated by resentment start to develop more mature political capacities. I really feel like I saw it. I mean, I feel like I underwent it myself. Honestly, I'll tell you the truth. When I walked in the door 2016 as like a pro-Bernie, like I'm here for the new millennial socialist thing, let's do it. A lot of my energy was really around my disgust with establishment Democratic Party figures, which is a kind of mirror image version of what you're talking about, Matt. I mean, I was driven in large part by resentment, but I swear to God, only took a few months of telling myself, I'm going to take this seriously. I'm going to show up. I'm going to organize in DSA. I'm going to get interested in unions and learn about them and show up to do strike solidarity for new concerns to supplant the old resentments. And I think that me and the other people that joined that project with me became better political actors, probably frankly better people over the course of those years. And my hope would be that, or I guess it's a counterfactual and a hypothetical anyway, but like had Bernie won, I still on some level believe that we could have made better political actors out of Americans through that process, even though the blowback would have been severe.
Well, that's just it. Is you're making better ones, but you're also making worse ones, and it's a question of who's got the numbers. And that's where I think you're less likely in that context to see the big boogeyman of liberal imaginings, a fascist takeover of America, because that center is gone with those heightening of political conflict. And yes, the emergence of these two new poles, that would end up resulting in good old American devolution, because you have states under basically completely dominated by the Republican Party, and would probably at some point escalate to some sort of nullification policy and stop cooperating with federal enactments. And what happens then?
So, guys, we're coming up on the end here, but let's get a little personal at the end of this season of Hinge Points. Meagan, first to you, what role do you think Jacobin would have played had Bernie won? What role is Meagan Day playing? And then, Matt, I'm going to ask you the same question about Chapo, because I'm curious, because both Jacobin and Chapo were really, they're of this moment, and they were made by the Bernie moment. Jacobin obviously comes beforehand, but it becomes this big national magazine. So I'm just curious. I'm sure you've thought about it, and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, of course I've thought about it. It seems I mentioned this earlier when I talked to you just now about like writing this article about all the executive orders that Bernie could pass, and thinking at least for one moment, like it seems so silly now. Just like thinking like the president's going to find my article very useful. And like the reason I'm laughing is because it seems so far away, but it really felt real. It felt real. There was a time period where I was thinking like Bernie's going to win, and I'm going to have to move to Washington, D.C. to cover his administration in a friendly manner, because it's all going to be hostile. And we need people on the Hill. We need journalists on the Hill finding out what's going on and reporting on the administration in some manner that isn't like completely hostile. And I was actually thinking to myself, like, I don't love D.C. I don't love the way it looks. I don't love the weather, but I'll do it. I'll do it if I need to. And then, of course, everything completely unravels. And then, like, now I'm sitting here in 2022 in Los Angeles thinking like, was that really me? Was I actually thinking like, okay, if you insist, I will move to Washington, D.C. But like, I actually think, that a lot of people, I think it sounds, again, kind of silly from the present, but like, if you really actually game it out in terms of Bernie Sanders winning, who's he going to staff his administration with? He's going to staff it with a lot of old timers who at least have some progressive credentials, or seem like they're not going to be like total turncoats, but have like the requisite expertise to be able to like manage the bureaucracy. But then he's also going to bring in a lot of ideologues to fill in the gaps, and that's a lot of people that we know straight up. Like I think that a lot of people like could have been involved in that administration, or at the very least would have been involved in a peripheral way in the sort of like support structures for the administration.
I mean, that's true, but frankly, the staffing of the campaign makes me think that the staffing of the administration might have had some problems, because even within the campaign, there are a number of people who were brought on because they represented some, fragment of the party, some network of patronage and insider shit, and they were a waste of money at best, if not outright hindrance. And you got to figure that that would be a challenge, would be the opportunists in the midst, because you can't screen for that, really.
It would have been so interesting. Like, it's really sad that we didn't get to play this out. That moment of like, okay, we all pitched in for this campaign and we won. Who's going to be represented in the administration? Like, what is the makeup? Is it going to be just like, Obama runoff? Or is it going to be like the ideologues who like showed up and like door knocked for Bernie?
I think it'd be both. And then they would fight it out. And there'd be a civil war within the administration.
No, I mean, I actually think that. Like, I actually think it would have been a mixture of both, because there literally aren't quite enough of either one of them. There aren't quite enough of either one of them to patch together, to cobble together a total administration, like every single thing that everybody needs to do. So actually it would have been both. And the dynamics that you started to see that we tried, I think a lot of us like tried to keep it like under wraps for the sake of the campaign, but there were definitely tensions in the campaign. And I think that they would have
I had no idea. Meagan,
did you? I'm informing you now for the first time that there were tensions in the Bernie campaign along these lines or similar lines. They would have definitely appeared in the administration, and it would have been so interesting to watch the way that it played out. And probably the ideologues would have been given a backseat for a variety of structural reasons, one of which being that they just don't have the experience necessary.
It would have depended on the issue area. I think in healthcare you could have seen a lot of movement. I think that would have been less true for certain areas like foreign policy. It's tough to know. But Matt, I know you need to go, but I'm curious, what role do you think like a Chapo, or really, if you don't want to talk about Chapo, the sort of indie left media space would have played?
I mean, of course, my fantasy of it is I would have been Bernie's press secretary and just got to go up there and scream at those idiots every day and own their shit. That's of course anyone's dream job. But I think Bernie probably wouldn't want to go that hostile off the bat. Maybe I'm like the fourth press secretary, like, as the ship's going down. But I don't think I'd have been the first one. So yeah, I think Chapo would still be there. It would probably have a higher profile, and of course, like there would be this, you'd have some sort of effort by mainstream media to like cater to this new reality and like, hey, I think some of us fantasize, not me, but some of us fantasize about like, oh, you're gonna get on MSNBC now, and then just be a talking head, but like a good one instead of a bad one, because now we have an actual president worth defending instead of just another Democrat. It would have been. I think it probably would have tried to stay independent and on the show, and yeah, it would have been a sort of an arm of the administration, I think, and that might have made it more boring over time, but it might have also made it more practically useful. Like one of our challenges is we have no idea what to tell people what to do, so we always are sort of at a loss when addressing a lot of issues, because we're left really just being able to relate to the sort of the most meta, abstract levels of any issue. I think that a Chapo that is a actual source, for action, a direct, like a coordinator and director of action for listeners. That I think that's what I would hope it would be. But it would all probably go down in flames. But even if that was true, even if the whole thing was a failure and it would just set the stage for a final reactionary turn that just abolishes this, this ghost of a movement that doesn't know it's dead yet before getting zapped with a proton pack and put it in the containment unit. Even if that's all it is, well, then that would have been still like upping the morphine drip, because it would have given life the drama of a purpose. The thing we're all missing, and the thing that's driving us all crazy, is that we know things are bad, getting worse, and we have an understanding of ourselves as autonomous beings, and yet we do nothing and can do nothing to avert our fate, and it just drives us to misery and anxiety, self-loathing, and hatred of others, and it kindles this desire to see others punished. I think even a failed Bernie campaign is a context of a struggle where a lot of those existential questions get answered for you, because instead of going online to scroll and get takes and curate your personality and finally hone your abstract opinions about issues and get entertained, in other words, it would be a extension of a daily terrain of struggle that you are finding somewhere, because there'd be something to do, at least for a while.
Very well said, Matt. Meagan Michelle Day, thank you for rounding out this second season of Hinge Points. Matt, thank you so much for doing it with me.
Yes,
this was
wonderful.
great. Everyone, thank you for listening. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Matt. Bye.